You know it's this. Take a perk and a talk of this shit. Money swallowed like sis. Did it perfect in the kid. Got a billion new single, my hater, the big better put on the road I just spent. I know we got $1 million, the devil, that shit ain't not cheap again.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to MangaMuse. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 10th part of What If Deku Enters Gravity Falls. Special note, this fanfic is written in a masterpiece of jkawsome on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. You're back, Izuku smiled at his friends as they took their seats. How are you feeling? What had happened with Zero looked bad. Shadow hadn't looked at all like himself, and then he'd looked absolutely horrified. When he hadn't come back to their booth, Mina had run off to find him, insisting that she go by herself. Now, Mina was smiling slightly, and while Shadow still looked pale, it wasn't nearly as bad. Better, Shadow admitted quietly. He turned to Zero, who had seated himself farther away from them than he'd previously been, and who jumped when Shadow addressed him. Again, I'm so sorry about that. Zero gave him a shaky thumbs up. No problem, just don't do it again, yeah? Of course, Shadow promised. It was cipher stuff, like we thought, Mina murmured to Izuku and Ochako. Something about this place is making it worse today. Hopefully there aren't any more incidents before Ford finishes the charm, but at the very least, I'd rather they be more weirdness knowledge, or even memories, Shadow admitted, just as quietly. And those are far more common, so that's probably what's going to happen. Right. Ochako reached over and squeezed Shadow's hand. Just a few more hours. What did we miss? Mina asked, loud enough that those around them could hear. Ojiro smiled dryly. Well, Kaminari massively underestimated Shiozaki. She took him out pretty quickly. Now Ida is going up against Hatsume, which should be interesting. Ochako grinned. She and Izuku had sat with Ida in the waiting room, helping him steady his nerves, and he seemed mostly calm and confident about his chances. Ida's got this, I'm sure of it. While I agree, we shouldn't underestimate Hatsume's creativity and inventions, Yaoyorozu pointed out. Although apparently she's lending some of them to Ida for the fight, which could make him even better. Izuku, who had lived with a businessman for over 3 months, winced. She's about to use him as a walking advertisement, isn't she? Makes sense, Shadow agreed. If she lent him her inventions, it's probably so she can show off how he moves with her gear. Ojiro winced. Ouch. Poor guy. This is going to be a mess, isn't it? Maybe it won't be, Ochako, ever the optimist, offered. Ida might come out of this looking good, maybe. At the very least, Stan's going to enjoy watching this, Mina said with a dry grin. Mr. Pines, please stop laughing, you're going to choke. I'm fine, Stan crowed, slapping his knee, tears streaming out of his eyes. Mirth etched all over his face as Hatsume continued with her advertisement. Forget the explosion brat, this girl's fantastic. If she was in our world, I'd hire her in an instant. She's like a mix of you and McGucket. Crazy fully included, Wendy commented dryly, but there was a grin on her face. I feel kind of bad for Ida, though. At least he's going to move on to the next round. Oh no, Ida, Izuku groaned sympathetically, as Hatsume stepped out of bounds 10 minutes later. That's got to sting, Yaoyorozu agreed, wincing. Being used as a walking advertisement like that, and during a sports festival as well. At least since Hatsume stepped out of bounds, he'll be able to move on and prove his worth in the next round. He'll have to put on a good showing if he wants to live that down though, Shadow noted. Mina nodded along, but she was also smiling. Those were some pretty convincing arguments for her gear, though. I'd still like to see if I can get my hands on some of that. And honestly, she kind of reminds me of a young Stan mixed with McGucket. That was some serious showbiz. Ochako turned to her, absolutely horrified. No, we can't let her and McGucket meet. That would be a disaster. Oh sure, but it would also be a funny and inventive disaster. I wonder how her tech would mix with McGucket's actually, Izuku mused. Maybe we should compare notes. McGucket was someone we met in Gravity Falls, Shadow explained to their confused friends. Bit of a mad inventor. Kirishima nodded. Gotcha. As cool as he sounds though, maybe we should focus on comforting Ida first. That was a disaster, Hagakure chimed in helpfully, from her spot next to Ajiro. Yeah, you're right, Izuku stood. Let's go find him. I need to prepare for my match too, so it'll be good to head down there anyways, Mina agreed. I can't believe she used me like that. Ochako patted Ida's back sympathetically. It's not your fault, Ida. You're just earnest. And a bit gullible, she decided not to add, because habits were hard to break and a part of her was already considering how much Ida could be conned for if he visited the shack. She's not supposed to take advantage of another student. This is UA. We're all training to be heroes. Ida paused and considered. Well, I suppose that doesn't count for her, as she's in the support course, but still. Companies will certainly be looking at her, at least, Yayurazu said. She was cunning enough to get into the tournament in a sports festival filled with heroes, and all of her creations were inventive. Not to mention actually getting a hero student to wear them in an official match. Ida turned to her with a look of betrayal, and she smiled apologetically. Sorry, Ida. My parents own a support company. I can't help but think about how they'd look at this. It's all right, Ida finally admitted. I'll admit that I was bested. I only hope to prove myself during my next match. You totally will, Mina promised. Just like I'm gonna go out and prove myself right now. Ah, that's right. You're up next. I apologize for wasting your time. Mina waved him off. Don't worry about it. I'll be fine. Ochako agreed with that statement. Aoyama seemed nice and all, but she wasn't particularly concerned for her friend. A laser wasn't going to be enough to take her friend down. Not by a long shot. We're gonna keep right on going with the 5th match, Present Mike declared. Even though he's wearing a belt, he won't transform. From the hero course, it's Aoyama Yuga versus, is something going to come out of those horns? Well, from the hero course, it's Ashido Mina. What was that supposed to mean, Mina wondered. Of course nothing's coming out of them. You should know that, Mike-sensei. She rolled her eyes and focused back on her opponent. Here we go, Aoyama announced. Try not to be too dazzled by my brilliance. She grinned. Yeah, you won't need to worry about that. Now, why don't we get moving? 5th match, start. Aoyama immediately shot a laser beam at her, and Mina reflexively dodged, even before moving on to her acid. She danced around his blasts, making sure that her moves were a bit more dramatic than they needed to be, all the better to show off her flexibility to the pros. Then she moved in, dodging around Aoyama's attack once again, and, while covering her hand in acid, pressing said hand on his belt. Then, as quickly as she could, she maneuvered him into position and threw him lightly over her shoulder. Aoyama sailed out of bounds, landing on his butt about 15 feet away from the edge of the arena, looking stunned. The crowd cheered. Midnight, knowing her quirk, blinked in surprise, but seemed to recover immediately. Aizawa must have told her about Mina's strength. Aoyama is out of bounds. Ashido advances to the next round. Aoyama's knocked out. Ashido's easy victory is indisputable. Stan grinned and slapped his leg. Damn straight it is. That was awesome, Suze agreed. Izuku's fight was nerve-wracking, and Shoto's fight was weird, so it was nice to see one of them get an actual cool fight. I'm sure we'll see more cool fights in the quarterfinals, Fayumi assured him. Wendy raised an eyebrow at their friend, who grinned and waved at the audience from down below. She drew that out. She could have taken him down much more easily. Stan nodded along, still grinning. Kids got showmanship. Always a good thing to have, especially when you're on live television. Wendy figured that Stan of all people would know about that, and decided not to argue. That was so cool, Jiru said, looking delighted. But since when has Ashido been that strong? I know she's part of your sparring group, but that's way more than anyone without a strength quirk can usually manage, especially at our age. Momo shrugged. I'm not sure. She's been showing off that sort of strength since she got back from Oregon. Truth be told, she had her theories. The 3 months rather than 3 days, the size-changing light, Ashido's strength, Uraraka's strange glowing levitation powers, and whatever green light Momo had seen covering Midoriya's fingers after he broke them during his match that completely healed them in a second. Whatever happened in Gravity Falls, Oregon, It was far more than they were talking about. She knew Ida suspected it as well, but he'd insisted they let their friends have their privacy, and Momo agreed. Hopefully they'd tell them when they were ready. Besides, she had her own match to worry about now. Flash bombs. But could Tokoyami block them? How many would she need to stun him for a long enough time? And once she had diminished Dark Shadow, how would she finish him? She needed to get in close. Dark Shadow had both excellent defensive and offensive capabilities, but Tokoyami himself wasn't much of a fighter, from what she'd observed. If she could get close to him, she could throw him out of bounds. Now, we've got no time to lose. Let's move on to the 6th match. Momo sucked in a nervous breath. Looks like I'm up next. You'll do very well, Ida insisted. We all believe in you. Yeah, you're super manly, Kirishima agreed. You've got this, Yaoyorozu. Good luck, Todoroki offered. Try and get in close, was Midoriya's suggestion, which confirmed what Momo was already thinking. She smiled at her friends, touched that so many of her classmates were supporting her. I'll do my best. She certainly had to win now. She refused to let down their trust in her. Offense and defense in one body. The Dark Samurai accompanied by Dark Shadow. From the hero course, it's Tokoyami Fumikage versus All-Purpose Creation. She was admitted through recommendations, so her abilities are certified. From the hero course, it's Yaoyorozu Momo. You think she can do it? Ochako asked, as they watched Yaoyorozu face Tokoyami down. She's got a good chance, Izuku assured her, staring at the match intently, excited to see how things would play out. She's definitely smart enough to think around her opponent. Not that Tokoyami is a slouch, but we all know how smart Yaoyorozu is. And she knows that Tokoyami is weak to light, and that she should get in close to finish him. If she can put all of that into practice, then she's got this. You can do this, Yae Momo, Mina shouted. Ready, start. Immediately, Dark Shadow headed right for Yaoyorozu. She dropped something on the ground, before barely dodging, running across the arena. Dark Shadow followed her, and again she narrowly avoided him, dropping created items that were too small for Izuku to make out. The expression on her face was nervous, but determined. After leading Dark Shadow all around the arena, Yaoyorozu created a trigger and pressed it. All at once, the objects on the ground started flashing brightly. Izuku squinted against the glare. Flash bomb mines? That's so cool. And a really smart idea too. They're all around the arena and going off all at once, which means that Dark Shadow has no escape from them. Inside the flashing arena, he could barely make out Yaoyorozu running forward, creating some kind of shield to defend against a weakened Dark Shadow with, and pushing Tokoyami out of bounds. By the time the light died down, Tokoyami was outside the arena, looking stunned, and Yaoyorozu was still inside, breathing heavily. Tokoyami is out of bounds, Midnight announced. Yaoyorozu moves on to the next round. With the rest of their friends, Izuku cheered as loudly as he could. Minutes later, Yaoyorozu and Tokoyami both returned to the booth. Tokoyami looked disappointed but accepting, while Yaoyorozu was beaming. You both did great, Ojiro encouraged them. It's all right, you don't have to exaggerate, Tokoyami said. Dark Shadow and I were soundly defeated by Yaoyorozu's strategy. I knew acting fast was the only way I could defeat you, Yaoyorozu admitted. Had the match lasted any longer, you would have won. Perhaps. It seems I will also have to better accustom Dark Shadow to fighting in bright light. Perhaps I didn't win, but I think this match was still very instructive. Both of them sat down, and Mina leaned over to give Yaoyorozu a congratulatory hug. Yaoyorozu blinked, but then awkwardly accepted, still smiling. And I'm up next. Kirishima groaned. I still can't believe I'm fighting that Tetsutetsu guy. Who decided this? It was merely a bad luck of the draw, Ida assured him. Ojiro was similarly optimistic. If he hasn't been working on hand-to-hand, then you'll be able to beat him that way, even if you can't show off your quirk as well. Hard to show off my quirk anyways, considering what it is, Kirishima sighed. The fact that you're punching steel and not breaking a sweat will at least show them that you're as tough as he is, Izuku offered. I guess. Then he smiled. Still, you're right. I'll show everyone as best I can. After you've all won your matches, I'm not going to lose mine now. The 7th match is a match-up between redundant quirks, manly and passionate steel. From the hero course, it's Tetsutetsu versus manly and passionate hardening. From the hero course, it's Kirishima Ijiro. He could have at least described them differently, Shadow pointed out, as their friend faced off against the boy from Class B. Yeah, but he's probably drumming it up for the cameras, Mina pointed out. Generates more audience interest that way. Now people want to see which of the similar quirks will be stronger. She leaned forward and cupped her hands, excited. You've got this, Kirishima. That was you I heard, Yaoyorozu realized suddenly. You called me Momo. Oh, right. Mina grinned sheepishly. Thought it would be a nice nickname. Sorry, I should have asked you first. I don't mind, Yaoyorozu assured her, well and truly beaming. I've just never had a nickname before. I like it. Ready? Match, start. Both steel and hardening immediately went up, and Kirishima and Tetsutetsu ran forward, fists clashing. They do seem almost evenly matched, Ida noted. Tetsutetsu has good reflexes, and clearly at least a little training in self-defense, if nothing else. But Kirishima has the edge, Ijiro pointed out. Look, he's a bit faster, and his movements are clearly more practiced. I think he's got this. Ijiro was right. As Mina watched, Kirishima ducked and deflected around his opponent's attacks, slowly forcing Tetsutetsu backwards with not just punches, but kicks, the latter of which Tetsutetsu didn't seem ready to defend himself from. Familiar-looking kicks. He's using my moves, the dancing stuff I knew before Gravity Falls, mixed with the stuff Wendy taught us, Mina realized, delighted. He's taking a leaf out of my book. You go, Kirishima, you've totally got this. Sure enough, minutes later, Kirishima tricked Tetsutetsu with a feint and swept his legs out from underneath him. Tetsutetsu fell backwards, and his head landed outside the arena. Tetsutetsu is out of bounds. Kirishima advances to the next round. Mina cheered for her friend as loudly as she could. Uraraka's up next, right? Kaminari said. And against Bakugou. That's gotta be rough. Ashido snorted. Sure, for Bakugou. She's going to destroy him, Todoroki agreed, looking visibly pleased by this statement. Next to Tenya, Midoriya leaned forwards, clearly excited. Ochako's amazing. I can't wait for you guys to really see her in action. Tenya could certainly agree. From what he'd seen in their sparring group, and Uraraka's new levitation powers, she'd clearly improved by leaps and bounds. Perhaps it was wrong of him, then, to worry about this match, but still, she was up against Bakugou. There was no way it was going to be easy. The eighth and last match of the first round. He was kind of famous in middle school. This isn't the face of a regular person. From the hero course, it's Bakugou Katsuki versus, she's the one I'm rooting for from the hero course, it's Uraraka Ochako. Ochako squinted up at the commentator's booth. Thanks, Mike-sensei, deciding that it didn't matter. She turned her attention back to her opponent. Mike wasn't kidding. Bakugou sure was making a weird face. Despite that, his eyes were fixed on her. You're the one who makes things float, right, round face, Bakugou said. The one who keeps stupidly mooning over Deku. If you're going to withdraw, do it now. You won't be getting away with just an ouch. Ochako just stared at him for a moment, before his words sank in. Then came the rage. This asshole was looking at her like she was just a stepping stone, just a blip on the way to fighting Izuku or Shadow. He thought so little of her that he assumed she would be bothered by getting an ouch. Bakugou, telling her that she should withdraw. Ochako channeled all of her anger and smiled at him. Not a chance, Kekken. Bakugou's face twisted in fury. Eighth match, start. Bakugou immediately flew towards her, explosions propelling him forwards. Ochako summoned her power. Bakugou stopped mid-air, held in her telekinetic grip. Then she sent him flying backwards and out of bounds. The match lasted 5 seconds. The crowd was completely silent. Finally, Midnight got over herself. Bakugou is out of bounds. Uraraka advances to the next round. The audience erupted in cheers. Damn straight, Stan laughed. That's almost as good as Izuku kicking his ass. It's good to see her taking him down so easily, Fayumi agreed, smiling. I'm just glad that all of them made it to the next round. Katsuki looks kind of in shock, Suze noticed. You'd think he'd almost never lost before, or something. Round face. It was the first match in the tournament, and he lost. Not to Izuku or Deku, but to fucking Round Face. This wasn't supposed to happen. Round Face's quirk made things float. She wasn't telekinetic, right? There must have been some trick to it, just like Deku had suddenly pulled out that quirk. He knew she didn't have that power before their 3-month trip to fucking Oregon. She'd cheated, and Katsuki had lost in the first round. He started forward, determined to give her a piece of his fucking mind, alongside several explosions, but then that stupid glow was back, and he couldn't move. Round Face raised an eyebrow at him. Really? You're going to try attacking me when the battle is over? Like you have any room to talk, Katsuki spat. That wasn't your fucking quirk. You're right, Round Face agreed easily. It's a power I got later on, back in Oregon. But it's still my power. It's still a part of me, not something you can remove. Are you upset, Bakugou? Because it isn't fair. Did you think picking on a seemingly quirkless kid as soon as you got a strong quirk was somehow fair? She glared at him. Face it, Kaken. You've been throwing your weight around because you were born lucky, and as soon as it turns out Izuku was born even luckier and unlocked a really strong quirk, you started crying about how he tricked you. You're not a hero, you're just a whiny bully. Katsuki felt himself released, and Round Face turned and walked away from him, like he wasn't even worth her time, much less Deku's time. Katsuki had lost in the first round. He'd been defeated almost as quickly as Flat Face, and just as soundly. He was put on the same level as fucking Flat Face. He stared at Round Face's back, even as he was ushered out of the arena. What was that? I did tell you she'd destroy him, Shoto told their gobsmacked classmates, as they all cheered for Ochako. Yeah, but, Jiru searched for words, not like that. Isn't she so cool, Izuku gushed? Kirishima's sweat dropped. Oh man, I'm going to have to fight her next. Mina patted his arm sympathetically. It was nice knowing you, Kiri. Hey! Shoto watched his friends talking excitedly around him, and found himself smiling. After all of this, he could almost forget what had happened during his own match, all of the wrongness in the air. Soon. Ford will be done with the charm soon. Then everything will be fine. As fun as this was, the end of the day couldn't come fast enough. Now, let's get started with the second round. Izuku blinked slightly. Already? He turned to Shoto. Well, I guess we're up. Are you going to be okay? Shoto nodded. Yeah. What happened with Zero? He winced. It won't happen again. I'm not going to do that to you. Or any other opponent, if I win. I didn't mean to imply you would, Izuku assured him. I just know it's been a bad day and all. And anyways, I don't want you going easy on me, he grinned at his friend. Like you said before, we've got to show off for the pros, right? We're gonna make this look really cool. So don't hold back, alright? Shoto nodded. Right. Let's do this. We'll be rooting for both of you, Mina promised. Good luck to you both, Ida agreed. Thanks, guys. With that, Izuku headed out of their booth and towards his entrance into the arena. Honestly, he couldn't help but be excited for the fight. While they'd both won their first matches, neither had really gotten to actually show off their skills, albeit for different reasons. And it certainly wasn't going to be an easy match, either. Izuku's quirk worked best up close, and Shoto was better at hand-to-hand combat. Then again, Izuku was faster and stronger thanks to full cowling, and with his regeneration powers, Shoto wouldn't be able to knock him out. In that case, he'd probably try to either get Izuku out of bounds or immobilize him with ice. He'd have an easy time knocking Izuku out of bounds if he used his flames, but Izuku suspected he wouldn't, especially after Zero. Despite them agreeing to go all out, Izuku could understand that. That meant Shoto would be using his ice and fire. Possibly wind as well, although he'd only used it once, so he might not be willing to use it in a full-on fight. Or maybe he would since he'd been getting the explosions ready. Izuku hadn't seen what Shoto creating wind looked like himself, only seen Bakugou go flying back. He'd have to be on the lookout for that. Shoto undoubtedly wouldn't use his fire as much as his ice, but it was still something Izuku would need to be careful to avoid. The ice was the trickiest part, since that could actually immobilize him. If Izuku were Shoto, he'd start with an opening wave of ice, either to trap Izuku or push him out of bounds. So then the best way to defeat Shadow would be to use full cowling to jump over his ice and get in close from the beginning. Orange flames suddenly stepped into view, and Izuku found himself face to face with Endeavor. Sharp blue eyes glared down at him, and Izuku stared back up at the face of the man who'd made his friend's life hell, who had ignored and then hid Fayumi, the woman who was an amazing sister to his friend and wonderful person, who was constantly hurting Shadow under the guise of training. "Oh, there you are," Endeavor said, and Izuku blinked. "I watched your fight. You have a wonderful quirk, causing so much wind pressure just by flicking your fingers. If we're talking about power alone, yours is comparable to All Might's. And, of course, you were one of the students taken at the Asaja. Don't think I don't remember you." Izuku swallowed. There was no way. He couldn't have figured it out. "Thank you, I guess," he managed, trying to keep any wavering emotion from his voice. "I need to get to the match now." With that, he continued to walk forwards, eyes focusing straight ahead of him. "It is my Shadow's duty to surpass All Might," Endeavor continued, and Izuku almost startled, because was he really going to be that upfront about it? He might be scampering around with you right now, but he'll learn better soon, and his match with you will be a very instructive test bed. Please don't disgrace yourself in it." Izuku stopped in his tracks, grit his teeth. "You called my quirk as powerful as All Might's," he said. "That doesn't mean I'm him." Endeavor scoffed. "That's obvious." "It is, isn't it?" Izuku agreed quietly. "Then it should be obvious that Shadow isn't you, either. If you actually cared about him, and not just what he could do for you, then you would have realized that. But you don't. You don't even know your own son." "Excuse me?" Izuku ignored the danger in Endeavor's voice and kept right on walking, fists clenched. He needed to leave before he punched the man in the face and caused a scene. That was probably the last thing Shadow needed right now. "Who do you think is going to win?" Ida wondered, as they looked at their friends approaching the area. Ochako clasped her hands together and considered the question. "Honestly, I don't know. It could go either way. Both of their quirks are strong and versatile, and they've been training a lot with them." She knew that if Shadow used his flames, the fight would be less even, but she also suspected that he wouldn't be doing that, which meant this was a quirk fight only. Izuku's been practicing with his quirk for as long as Shadow's been working on his fire, but Shadow also has years of training with his ice, Mina reminded her. "Plus, Shadow's better at hand-to-hand. My money's on him." "Izuku's adaptable, though," Ochako pointed out. "If there's anyone who can figure out a way to work around Shadow's advantages, it's him." "So it's really anyone's game," Kirishima summed up. "Oh man, this is gonna be so cool. The first match-up between two of our dudes, huh?" Suze munched on his own popcorn. "I wonder who's gonna win." Stan leaned forward, excited. "Oh, now this is gonna be good. I'm so glad it's being recorded at Izuku's house. People back home are gonna pay good money to see this fight in particular." Fayumi let out a sigh, but couldn't stop the amused smile creeping up on her face. She liked Izuku, of course, but she was very much rooting for her little brother. "Thanks for waiting, everybody. The first match of the second round is a big match. The guy who won a huge victory in the first round and left the audience frozen from the hero course. It's Todoroki Shadow. On the other hand, he had a great showing in the first two events, but barely made it past the first round. What kind of fight will he show us this time? From the hero course, it's Midoriya Izuku." This fight was going to be tricky. Shadow had no doubt of that, especially since he didn't intend to use his flames unless absolutely necessary. Izuku was smart, strong, quick, and tough. If Shadow wanted to win, he'd have to go for immobilization or pushing Izuku out of bounds. His best bet, he suspected, was the latter. Even if he froze Izuku in ice, if it wasn't up to at least his shoulders, his friend might be able to break out using one for all, especially since whatever fingers he broke doing so would immediately heal. Or not immediately. It took about a second for Izuku's fingers to fully heal. Shadow could use that time. Shadow did intend to make use of his new wind trick again, but he'd have to wait for the perfect moment. If he could get Izuku out of bounds without it, that would be even better. From the other side of the arena, Izuku grinned at him. "You ready?" Shadow smiled back. "Yeah, let's give them a show." At this year's sports festival, both have shown top-class performances. But who will come out on top? Now Midoriya versus Todoroki, match start. Shadow shot 2 waves of ice, limiting the range in which Izuku could move, before blasting a 3rd wave right towards him. Izuku lit up with green sparks and jumped over it, coming in close for a punch. Shadow dodged, his other arm lighting up with fire and forcing Izuku backwards. So Izuku had already brought the fight into close range, where he was stronger. That was fine after their time in Gravity Falls. Shadow was no slouch in this range either. Still, his best bet was to limit his friend's options. Izuku could cover the entire arena fairly quickly, and so Shadow needed to maneuver him in the direction that would be easiest for Shadow to then send him out of bounds. There wasn't much more time to think. Izuku was closing the gap again, and Shadow barely dodged his punches, feeling himself being forced backwards. Even as they traded blows, again and again, he could tell that One for All was giving Izuku the advantage, despite the less time he'd spent training in combat. Whenever he tried to maneuver around to give himself more space, Izuku was there. He swept out a leg, and Izuku jumped over it. Ice raced from the ground where his leg was upwards, catching one of Izuku's feet in ice. Izuku sucked in a breath, before flicking downwards, blasting the ice and concrete apart and sending Shadow flying backwards. He had to send his ice behind him to steady himself, and make sure he didn't fly out of bounds. By the time he'd recovered, Izuku was already healed and charging forwards again. This time, Shadow wasn't able to dodge the punch, and found himself flying backwards again, before catching himself and flipping himself over with his hand so that he landed on his feet. Izuku's furious expression, "You need to stop screwing around." Blue eyes and dyed black hair, watching them fight on television, bitterness and resentment battling for dominance as he watched the masterpiece fight. Shadow shook his head, clearing away the memories that weren't his, but also didn't seem to be Cipher's. The last thing he needed now was to be distracted by them. The longer they spent as close as they were, the better chance Izuku had of winning. Shadow needed to move him away, and fast. As Izuku came towards him, Shadow slid out of the way, using his ice as a ramp. Izuku's strengths lay in close quarters combat, which meant that he would have to come to Shadow. It was risky, but if he could make Izuku follow him towards the edge of the arena, then he'd have a good chance of blasting him out of bounds. Judging by the look in Izuku's eyes, he knew it too. For a moment, the two of them considered each other. Then Izuku raised his thumb and middle finger together, towards where Shadow was. Blast of air pressure. Shit. Shadow threw up his ice behind him and then iced his feet to the ground right before the blast of air hit. It still sucked the air out of his lungs and nearly knocked him off his feet. By the time Shadow recovered, Izuku was running forwards again. Two could play at that game. However, Shadow bent the air temperature under his quirk and waited until Izuku was almost in front of him, jumping forward to deliver a punch, before he let the gust of wind fly. It struck true, knocking Izuku back. Shadow didn't waste another second. As soon as Izuku hit the floor, he sent out a wave of ice, which covered everything from the feet to the shoulders, immobilizing his friend in his position lying down on the ground. Izuku struggled for a moment, clearly trying to activate One for All, but Shadow had seen how Izuku always activated his quirk, and had made sure to immobilize him in all the right places. Izuku realized this too, given the groan that came out of him. "Midoriya is immobilized," Midnight declared. "Todoroki moves on to the next round." The crowd cheered as Shadow melted his ice and helped Izuku to his feet. That was a good match. "No kidding," Izuku agreed, laughing awkwardly. He looked disappointed, but not defeated. "You really got me on that last part." "I've also been training with my quirk for years longer than you have," Shadow pointed out. "Considering you only stopped breaking your bones 3 weeks ago, that was really impressive." "I guess. I was really hoping I could last for longer, though." Shadow considered this. "I got you at the end because you tend to leap a bit when delivering your punches. You don't do it when we're just sparring, only when full cowling is active. It throws you off your balance because you're not used to it." "I didn't even realize I did that," Izuku admitted. "I'll make sure to work on it, then." "So youthful," Midnight gushed at them, which was kind of weird, but Shadow decided not to question it. "You know," Suze mused, "watching this tournament, now I'm thinking about a lot of our adventures back home, and how differently they could have gone if quirks worked in our world. These dudes are amazing." Wendy let out a low whistle. No kidding. We saw a bit of it back in the bubble, sure, but that was nothing like this. They're doing so well, Fayumi gushed happily. You guys were so cool, Ijiro said, as Todoroki and Midoriya rejoined them. You both really put on a show out there. You think? Midoriya said, grinning awkwardly. I hope so. Uraraka was quick to reassure him. You did great, Deku. Kirishima's right. You both looked really cool. I'm sure a lot of pros are impressed. Honestly, Midoriya put up a better fight than Ijiro suspected he would in his own quarter-final match. He was going to try his hardest, of course, but he'd been racking his brain, and he couldn't figure out a way to avoid Uraraka throwing him out of bounds like she did with Bakugou. Jiro leaned back in her seat. Ida's up next, right? Against that Shiozaki girl from Class B. You think he'll be okay? She took down Kaminari super easily. Don't remind me, Kaminari groaned. It was a bad matchup, Midoriya said sympathetically. Shiozaki was able to ground Kaminari's electricity, so it's no wonder she won. For Ida, he just has to be faster than Shiozaki's vines. If he can outmaneuver them, then he'll win the match. Down below them, where Ida and Shiozaki were preparing to fight, Ijiro could guess Ida was thinking the same thing, with the way he was getting into a sprinting position. Match, start. Immediately, Shiozaki shot out her vines towards Ida. It was no use, however seconds later, Ida was behind her, grabbing her by the shoulders, then pushed her towards the boundary. She crossed the boundary line, still looking stunned. On the sidelines, Midnight blinked, before smiling. Shiozaki is out of bounds, Ida wins. Ijiro cheered with the rest of their friends. After that, he'll put at least most of his first-round mess behind him, Todoroki said. For sure. Great job, Ida. Beside him, Ashido shot a smile Yaoyorozu's way. Looks like we're up next. You ready, Momo? Yaoyorozu blinked, before smiling back, just as determined. I am. I look forward to our match. Ready, start. Mina was right, when she'd been thinking about how her fights would go. Aoyama was easy, but Yaoyorozu was going to be tricky. On the other side of the arena, her friend summoned what looked to be some kind of handheld cannon, aimed, and fired. Mina barely dodged to the side as a blast of air that would have knocked her out of the arena flew past her, whistling by her ear. Just like Aoyama, getting in closer would be key here. She sped forwards on her acid, and Yaoyorozu created a shield to deflect her attack with. Mina let her acid cover her hands to dissolve the shield, and nothing happened. Yaoyorozu smiled. Sorry, I made sure to come prepared. Mina grinned. No worries, just means I've got to try a little harder. She stepped back, before leaping out of range of the staff Yaoyorozu created. For a little while, she played offense, sliding around the arena and out of range of Yaoyorozu's attacks. Still, Mina was confident in her skills. All she needed was a moment to get past Yaoyorozu's defenses. With that in mind, she switched up her plan and went back on the offensive herself, forcing Momo to use the shield to block her acid attacks. An opening there, as Yaoyorozu directed her shield away from her body to block one of Mina's projectiles. Mina dove in and grabbed her arm. Without wasting another second, she flipped Yaoyorozu over and threw her out of the arena, like she had with Aoyama. Yaoyorozu is out of bounds. Ashido wins. Mina ran over to her friend as the crowd cheered. That was so cool. How did you make an acid-resistant shield like that? She paused. Also, I don't suppose you could incorporate that into other materials, because it seems like it could be really useful for me. Like, in general. I haven't thought much about it. Aside from the weapons I used for this fight, Yaoyorozu admitted, taking Mina's hand and letting herself be helped to her feet. But I'll certainly consider it. That was a good match. Definitely, and next, she was going up against Ochako. That was probably going to be even more fun, especially considering what she had planned. Match, start. Fayumi blinked as Ochako rushed into combat range, rather than simply sending Kirishima out of bounds like she did with Bakugou. That's different. Is she going easy on him? Wendy shook her head. Don't think so. Look, they're duking it out, see? Ochako showed off her power in her last fight, and Kirishima showed that he was good at combat in his last fight. So now she's fighting him to show that she's strong in that area too, Suze finished, beaming. That's smart. If people are recruiting here, it's always good to show off multiple talents. Stan squinted at the fight in front of them. Hang on, did she just make him float? There's no blue glow this time? Fayumi looked down at a surprised Kirishima and realized Stan was right. Oh, that must be her quirk. Then, I guess she's showing that off as well. A well-placed kick, and Kirishima floated across the arena line. Ochako pressed all of her fingertips together, and he fell to the ground. Kirishima is out of bounds. Uraraka wins. Young Midoriya? Izuku nearly jumped before turning around with a smile. All Might. All Might gave him a thumbs up. I've been looking for you since the first round. You didn't look so hot after your fight with Shinso from General Studies. You all right? Izuku blinked before nodding, smile only slightly more forced than before. I'm all right. Shinso's quirk just brought up some bad memories. He winced. And I only got to the quarterfinals. And I'm not super mad about that, because Shadow won fair and square, and I obviously still have a long ways to go, but losing is still frustrating, even when it's your friend that you're losing against. All Might finished. Izuku winced. It sounds really petty when put that way. I mean, we both knew only one of us would make it past this round, and I never wanted to be a sore loser, especially not with my friends. All Might put a gentle hand on his shoulder. Young Midoriya, there is nothing petty about what you're feeling. You four have clearly been through a lot together, and you've been helping each other at every other point during this festival. A little healthy competitiveness is nothing to be ashamed of, and neither is being bothered by losing. I'm sure young Todoroki will understand. Izuku nodded slowly. Yeah, you're right. He'd get it. It's just kind of stupid, you know? I do. Something in All Might's sunken eyes twinkled with amusement. Believe it or not, I have lost fights before, even after I was given one for all. I didn't win my first sports festival either. Izuku's mouth fell open without any input from him. Wait, really? You didn't? All Might laughed. Lost to a girl who could teleport anywhere within her line of sight. I may have picked up our quirk faster, and I might not have broken as many bones as you did, but I still needed time to adjust as well. Wow. Then the rest of the words, and the way All Might phrased them, sunk in, and Izuku's eyes widened. Wait, you said you needed time to adjust as well, and you've never mentioned what quirk you had before you got one for all. Where were you? I was also quirkless, All Might confirmed gently. Honestly, I thought you'd ask sooner, considering how much you love to analyze quirks. But yeah, my own master had a quirk, but she saw something in me, and chose me to be the next holder of one for all. He looked at Izuku, and his gaze was so fond that Izuku found himself trying to hold back tears. At first, I saw the old me in you, but now it's clear that you're already growing into your own, using one for all in ways I never would have considered. So don't be so harsh on yourself, young Midoriya. You're a good student and a great friend. I'm sure young Todoroki feels the same way. Izuku's lip trembled, and he wiped at his eyes. Thanks, All Might. I think I needed that. Of course, All Might agreed instantly. And with young Shinso, you said his quirk brought up bad memories? Would you like to talk about it? Once again, Izuku debated telling All Might about the bubble. And he really wanted to. All Might had already trusted him with so much. He wasn't like most authority figures, he actually cared, and had proved it time and time again. But he wasn't ready. So Izuku shook his head. Sorry, I don't think I'm ready to talk about it right now. That's perfectly understandable, All Might said immediately. I just hope you know that if you do ever want to talk, I'll always listen. I know. Thanks, All Might. And he did know, which kind of made it worse. These kids really are amazing, aren't they? Abra said. Next to him, Inko sniffed, reaching for another tissue. They are. It's also scary, though, going up against giant robots and massive pits and minefields, and everyone was attacking them all at once during the cavalry battle, another sniff. And now they're all fighting each other. Aburo chuckled. Yeah, but they're in good hands, I promise. Shouta, Nimiri, and Hisashi won't let anything happen to them. Because Nimiri was acting as referee for the events, and Hisashi was commentating, with Shouta in the booth with him. Nimiri was wearing a toned-down version of her old costume. Hisashi had both grown his hair long and banana-shaped, as well as grown a wispy mustache, and Shadow looked just the same as Oboro remembered, except tired and with more scars, a few remaining bandages from the usti, and longer hair. And it was. They were adults. They were 30. And here Oboro was, sitting in the living room with the parent of one of their students, who'd saved him from being a villain and broken him out of Tartarus, 17 and legally dead, and watching his adult best friends on television. He'd been trying really hard not to think too much about it before today. He knew there was no making up for lost time. He knew his friends had moved on without him. And watching them now, he was kind of okay with that. It still hurt. Seeing everything he'd missed because he'd gotten himself basically killed and that Doctor was a bastard was physically painful, like someone reaching into his chest and squeezing his heart near to bursting. He desperately missed his friends. But they looked happy. And it had been 13 years, of course they'd moved on. Oboro was glad they moved on from him. Shouda, Hisashi, Nimori, they all deserved the best. They deserved to become pros and find happiness, even if he wasn't there to share it with them. So while seeing his friends on TV hurt, there was also something nice about seeing them, 13 years later, alive and with jobs they wanted, although he was still kind of confused about the whole Shouda teaching thing and content, even if he wasn't a part of that. It's done. Oboro turned around to see Ford entering the room, beaming and holding up a shiny gem carved with strange markings, fashioned on a cord of glowing rainbow colors, twisted with all sorts of sparkling lights. I've finished the charm. Oboro and Inko both jumped to their feet. That's great. I'll take you to him, then. Right away, Ford agreed. Just remember to be wary of any anti-warp technology. Both of you, be careful, Inko fretted slightly. Then she managed a smile. But if you can, please tell Izuku and the others that they've done so well, and I'm so proud of them. Of course, Oboro promised, grinning. Then he took Ford's hand and imagined the space outside of the first-year stadium. His storm clouds swirled around them, before depositing them right outside. Apparently, he'd been pretty damn lucky with where he decided to jump, brushing up against the edge of his clouds. Oboro could almost feel whatever anti-warp ward was put up, staticky and crackling and cracking and weird. Ford, still holding Oboro's hand, seemed to notice it too, because he flinched violently, eyes wide. What the hell is this? Oboro frowned, confused. It's the anti-warp technology, right? I mean, I can move past it, but my clouds don't seem to want to. He stepped inside the anti-warp field, shivering as he passed through, and felt his clouds start up again. Although I guess they work inside of it, but I can't warp out now that I'm in, only move to other places inside. Ford still looked highly unnerved. This might function as anti-warp technology, it might even be designed specifically for that, but it's more than that. I've felt this energy, this weirdness, before. If I'm right, he turned to Oboro. Take me back to Inko's house, please. I need to get my instruments. I want to take readings and make sure I'm not overreacting. Well, if that wasn't ominous, Oboro didn't know what was. Still, he stepped back outside of the field and warped them back home. Hopefully Ford was overreacting, but this was the first time Oboro had heard the guy sound genuinely scared. And if something really was wrong, the mystery crew, Stan, Fayumi, Wendy, Suze, and Oboro's friends were inside, as well as all the other students and thousands of audience members. If Ford was right, they needed to figure out what was going on and warn everyone quickly. I have a request for you, Eraserhead. Shouda stared at Endeavor, unamused. I'm busy. Try someone else. Please, you've made it very clear you don't want to be commentating, Endeavor scoffed. Besides, I'm working security for your school, after you lost my son. The least you can do is check my skybox to see if someone has snuck inside while I'm working. Shouda bit down a sarcastic reply. He still hadn't forgotten Todoroki's bruises. Sure, when I find the time. Endeavor glared at him. Make time, Eraserhead. With that, he walked away, not even bothering with a goodbye. Shouda let out a long sigh. He really couldn't care less if someone was using Endeavor's skybox, especially considering that the man wasn't using it even during the moments he was clearly off duty. If he had to go, he'd probably just give whoever it was a light warning and escort them out. And Hisashi was already calling him over for the semi-finals. He could check the skybox after those were finished. So now it's Todoroki and Ida fighting, Momo mused, as their friends approached each other in the arena for the semifinals. Maybe it was wrong, but she was kind of hoping for Ida to win over Todoroki, as much as she wanted that to be the case. However, "Shu's gonna win this," Ashido said firmly, leaning back in her seat. She turned to Uraraka with a grin. "The real question is, who's he going to fight in the finals?" Uraraka grinned back, undaunted. "I guess we'll find out, won't we? But let's focus on Shoto and Ida's match for now. It's the first match of the semifinals. With both of them from hero families, it's a battle of the elites. From the hero course, it's Ida Tenya versus, also from the hero course, it's Todoroki Shoto. If Tenya was going to win this, then he needed to be fast. He'd seen Todoroki obliterate Zero, and while Midoriya had given him a challenge, he'd still prevailed over Midoriya's enhanced speed and strength. For Tenya to have a chance of beating him, he needed to get the match over with as fast as possible, especially after he used his Recipro Burst. Match start. Todoroki immediately shot out a wave of ice, and Tenya quickly dodged, running to avoid it. Before he could switch gears and get closer, Todoroki leaned down and shot out a second wave of ice with his fingertips, blocking Tenya in on the other side. There was nothing else for it. Todoroki sent out a third wave right towards him, and Tenya bent down before jumping over it at the last second. He soared over the wave, finding himself right above Todoroki. Now, Recipro Burst. He swung his leg down towards Todoroki's head, but the other boy dodged at the last second. Now he had 10 seconds before his engines stalled. He landed and jumped again, aiming for another Recipro Burst. For a moment, he thought he connected. Then ice shot up his leg, and Tenya landed awkwardly, shivering as the ice encased his whole body. Ida is immobilized. Todoroki advances to the finals. Tenya grimaced as the crowd cheered and Todoroki unfroze him. Considering how quickly he'd lost, it was probably a good thing Tensei was busy with work, and therefore wasn't watching him. "You were good," Todoroki said softly. "You almost got me with that second kick." "Almost didn't win me the match," Tenya sighed. "You were still too quick for me. But thank you." It seemed the best he could hope for now was third place. "It's really cool to see how far those two have gone in the tournament," Tsuyu mused, as Uraraka and Ashido approached the arena. "And no matter who wins, there's going to be a girl in the finals. I'm really rooting for them both, Kiro." Jiro nodded. "No kidding. They've both crushed it so far." "Hey, who do you guys think will win?" Hagakure asked the assembled group of friends, who had practically dominated the entire festival. "Ashido or Uraraka?" "Well, Uraraka's got her telekinesis thing that she has now," Kaminari pointed out, even though he wasn't addressed. "Ashido's doing great, but I don't think she can counter that." On anyone else, Todoroki's expression would have been stoic, but on him, it was practically a smirk. "She's taken steps to account for that in this fight. Ochako's not going to take her out so easily." He paused, considering. "I think Mina will win this one." Midoriya, who'd been muttering to himself, shook his head. "I'm not so sure. I think Ochako will win, but Mina definitely isn't going down without a fight." "I guess we'll see, then." Personally, Tsuyu would be happy if either of them won. She didn't know them very well, but they were both really nice, and their contribution towards the class' overall happiness and well-being with the timeout jar couldn't be understated. Either way, it was probably going to be a good show. Match 2 of the semi-finals, Present Mike announced. They worked together in the obstacle course and cavalry battle, and they both took the tournament by storm. But only one can make it to the finals. From the hero course, it's Uraraka Ochako, versus, also from the hero course, it's Ashido Mina. Mina beamed at her friend. Across the arena, Ochako beamed back. Match start. Mina felt the telltale sign of Ochako's telekinesis and grabbed her trusty weapon, firing it and watching it attach to Ochako as the audience gasped. Then, with the augmented grappling hook Hatsume made for her, she pulled Ochako in, swinging with a punch that her friend barely dodged. "Ashido has a grappling hook now. Did she petition for this?" "She did," Midnight assured the crowd, and Uraraka agreed to it. Ochako laughed, despite being in a trickier position than she'd been in before. It wouldn't be fair otherwise. Still, she ducked under another of Mina's blows, and Mina detached the hook for now. She'd use it again if Ochako tried to lift her out of bounds like that to make sure she couldn't pull off that trick without being dragged out of bounds as well. In close quarters combat, Mina had the advantage of strength and acid, while Ochako had the advantage of a bit more training. Mina also knew she had to be careful not to let Ochako touch any part of her with all 5 fingers. That was how she'd gotten Kirishima, after all. The two of them continued to trade blows, Mina dancing around Ochako on her acid, and Ochako keeping up with her, using her power to lift herself up slightly so she didn't slip on the acid Mina left behind. Ochako went in for an attempted touch with her zero gravity, and Mina barely dodged, before grabbing her arm and throwing her like she had her other opponents. Ochako, of course, managed to stop herself, hovering in the air, which is what Mina had been waiting for. She shot her grappling hook again, which attached itself to Ochako, before swinging it in a wide arc. Ochako went flying, barely managing to stop herself before she went out of bounds. Then Ochako held out a hand, and Mina found herself in a sort of tug of war, her super strength holding on to Ochako, versus Ochako's telekinesis attempting to force her to let go. Mina grit her teeth and dug her feet into the ground, determined to hang on. There was a sound of metal crushing. Mina looked down to see that, without meaning to, she'd crushed part of her hook. The line snapped, and Mina went flying backwards and out of bounds. As Shido is out of bounds, Uraraka advances to the finals. Mina pouted for a moment, before getting to her feet and jogging over to Ochako, smiling. "Congrats." "Thanks, sorry about your grappling hook." Mina waved her off. "Nah, I was the one who broke it. Besides, it's not my usual one, it's the one Hatsume made for me. Maybe if I give it back to her, she can figure out how to improve it so that I don't accidentally crush it again." Ochako nodded. "That's probably a good idea. Maybe she can figure out how to modify your actual grappling hook like that too, then." With this, the final match will be between Todoroki and Uraraka. Mina laughed. "Mystery Crew represent. Now I've just got to beat Ida, and we'll claim all 3 medals." "You can do it," Ochako encouraged. "And then we can go home and get that charm, and probably have Katsuden again, because it's Izuku's favorite, and he deserves something nice too." "Agreed." "Are you ready for this?" Shido considered Ochako's question. "Yeah, I am." As ready as he'd ever be, at least. Ochako, he suspected, was going to be the hardest fight in the tournament. And he was still off his game. He'd thought the feeling of wrongness had been brought down to a more manageable level after Zero, but it was still there, buzzing in the back of his mind, constantly reminding him that this place was wrong and weird and breaking. His hands itched, on a strange metaphorical level, and a part of him desperately wanted to flick them and summon his flames. He determinedly ignored it, clenching his hands into fists and trying to focus on anything but the wrong feelings. Just one more fight. One more fight, and the festival would be over, and he could go home and get that charm, and everything would be fine. Just one more fight. "How about you?" he asked. "I'm ready too," Ochako decided after a moment. She gave him a grin. "It's pretty cool though, isn't it? I mean, before Gravity Falls, when I thought about the sports festival, I never actually imagined that I'd be fighting in the finals. That win or lose, I'd be a medal finisher. I guess a part of me is still having trouble believing it." "You earned every win," Shido reminded her. He couldn't entirely relate he actually had expected to place in at least the top 3 before going to Gravity Falls. But he certainly couldn't have expected the festival to turn out the way it had. Ochako squeezed his hand. "So did you. Let's do our best, okay?" "Right." The two of them separated, before heading down their own walkways and out into the arena. It's finally the last battle of the Ua High School Sports Festival. The top of the first years will be decided with this one match. The final, so to speak, from the hero course, Todoroki Shido, versus, also from the hero course, Uraraka Ochako. Just one might fight, and it would finally be over. He could do this. Match, start. The final match between Todoroki and Uraraka would be starting soon, and here Shido was, trudging towards Endeavor's skybox. Truth be told, he was very interested to see how the match would go. Both Todoroki and Uraraka had demonstrated incredible control over their powers, even if Uraraka still wouldn't go into detail about her new abilities beyond, found a magic amulet in the other world that gave her telekinesis. And while all 4 students had clearly learned quirkless combat over in Gravity Falls, those 2 had proven to be the best at it. While Midoriya was certainly doing better, now that he wasn't breaking his bones, and Bakugou's explosions were powerful, it seemed fair to say that Todoroki and Uraraka were currently the students with the most of both control and raw power. Shouta would so much rather be in the commentator's box, analyzing their fight, and how the 2 of them would handle going up against someone with a power that could match theirs. And yet, Shouta was instead going to check out the damn skybox. Endeavor better hope someone was actually using it, because if it was empty, Shouta was going more pissed than he already was. As he approached the skybox, he heard voices, which at least confirmed that Endeavor wasn't just making things up. Shouta was tired from a long day of sitting in that box and commentating, especially after all the healing sessions with Recovery Girl that he'd gone through, and he was more than ready to just tell whatever idiots snuck into a private skybox to get out and move on. And then he heard the familiar voices inside. Telling you, she's got this in the bag. Not even Mina could beat her. Ochako's gonna win, for sure. I don't know, Mr. Pines. We really shouldn't count Shouta out that easily. You've seen how amazing his quirk is here. And if he actually went all out and stuff, dude could probably win. Sure, but he isn't going all out, is he? Maybe not, but he hasn't needed to before. Fighting Ochako might change that. Shouta had heard enough. Mind reeling, he opened the door to the skybox, and was met with 4 very familiar faces. There was Todoroki Fayumi, who Shouta had briefly seen when the 4 world-hopping students had reunited with their families. That explained the skybox she must have let the other 3 in. Except that the other 3 were Stan Pines and his 2 employees, who'd been introduced as Suze and Wendy, who, presumably, were supposed to be in an entirely different dimension where quirks didn't work. So how the hell were they in this skybox? Stan's brother, Ford, had mentioned working on a stable portal. But it hadn't even been a month since then, and none of the students had mentioned any sort of portal. Which, of course, didn't mean they didn't know about it. But that also brought plenty of questions to mind. Whatever the case, Shouta was going to have words with his problem children later. For now, he sighed. You know, Endeavor was very demanding when he insisted that someone was using his skybox without his permission. You'd better have a good reason to be here, I'm missing the match. To his delight, all 4 of them jumped and spun around. Todoroki Fayumi looked guilty, while Stan and Wendy both narrowed their eyes. Well, he isn't using it, is he? Stan said casually, quickly recovering. I don't see why it's a problem, then. And even if it is, that's on me, the elder Todoroki said, voice apologetic. I was the one who invited them here. There's nothing for you to apologize for, Wendy insisted, and now that he actually had time to consider her, Shouta took in just how young she was. She couldn't be much older than one of their 3rd years. He raised an eyebrow. Honestly, I couldn't care less about following through on Endeavor's errand, especially considering the more pressing questions now in front of me. Last I checked, 3 of you were in another universe. How exactly are you here? Stan mimicked him, raising a mocking eyebrow back. My brother did say he was working on something more stable so that we could see the kids again. In the background, Shouta could hear Hisashi calling for the start of the match. Behind the 4 skybox intruders, Todoroki threw up a massive ice wall around the entirety of the arena, presumably to stop Uraraka from telekinetically throwing him out of bounds like she had with her other opponents. And you didn't think to tell anyone about this? Why should we? Stan scoffed. Not like it's any of your business. We're very grateful that you helped the mystery crew get home, Suze offered, and Shouta guessed that mystery crew was a nickname for his problem children, most likely based off of the mystery shack. But you don't really have anything to do with us besides that. Sorry, dude. Shouta stopped himself from gritting his teeth, trying to explain to these people that, as heroes, they needed to be aware of potential threats like portals to other worlds was pointless. As much as it bothered him, he understood that from their point of view, there was no reason to respect heroes. This wasn't a meeting of heroes or government representatives from different worlds. This was a couple of people from some small town in Oregon deciding to visit some friends. It bothered him that Todoroki's sister hadn't come forward to explain any of this either. But then, Shouta considered his suspicions about Endeavor, and gathered that a distrust in authority might run in the family, and with good reason. He sighed, running a hand over his face. Vaguely, he could see Todoroki and Uraraka engaged in some strange version of quirked hand-to-hand in the background. I'm still going to have to let Nezu know about this, you know? Once the festival is over, I'll take you to him. We'll try to work this out from there. Yeah, sure, great. Can you leave and let us focus on the match now? Those two are really going at each other, and I don't want to miss more of it. Shouta sighed and opened his mouth to respond. Hey, we're here. Ford made the charm, except Shouta's fighting right now and something's really wrong with this place and it's really bad, so we came up here first. The ghost in the doorway blinked for a long moment, before an awkward smile crossed its face. Hey, Shouta. Shouta activated erasure. The ghost didn't disappear or reveal itself to be an illusion or an imposter. Its dark stormy hair didn't lighten, and its eyes didn't become blue. It just held up its hands in surrender. I know it's weird, but it's really me. I really didn't want us to meet this way. Hi. You're dead, Shouta said flatly, brain still not comprehending what was in front of him. I was. Sort of, the ghost Aburo said with a wince. But not really. It was kind of worse than that. But I'm back, and actually me again. If it helps, the last thing I remember is being experimented on right after my death was faked. So seeing you as an adult is really weird for me too. I don't think that's going to help him much, Shouta heard Wendy say. She sounded amused. In the background, Todoroki and Uraraka were having some sort of beam-o-war, orange flames starting to overpower whatever telekinetic grip Uraraka had on them. It barely seemed to matter. Shouta gripped his scarf tightly, muscles tense and ready to spring into action. If this is some sort of trick. Remember that morning I rescued Sushi? Oboro interrupted. And I was sopping wet, so I just changed in the classroom because my clouds covered me enough. And when we finished the finale of the Rune Waker's sequel, you were telling Hisashi to get a grip because he was sobbing, but you were crying too. I know all of this is crazy, but I promise it's really me. If that were true, then that meant Oboro was alive. Ford, Stan's brother who Shouta had noted as suspiciously absent from the group, sidestepped Oboro and entered the room, looking both apologetic and determined. I'm sorry Oboro, Aizawa, but reunions can come later. We have more important matters to deal with. More important matters? Oboro was alive. In the moment, everything else seemed secondary. But Oboro didn't seem to think so, standing up straighter. Right. Shouta, whatever is being used as anti-warp technology here in the stadium, it's bad. Really bad. Why did the principal agree to it, and also, how can we shut it down? Shouta blinked, finally managing to shake himself out of his stupor, before frowning. Nezu didn't have much of a choice. The Hero Commission insisted on it, even though it's experimental and untested, and since the sports festival is such a public event, they were able to get away with insisting on its use. What's wrong with it? From within the depths of his trench coat, Ford produced a bunch of strange machines, all showing readings Shouta couldn't understand. It's quite literally weakening the fabric of your reality within this localized area. I recognize the feeling from my own multiversal travels. It's not just dissolving the bounds between any old reality and yours. The reality on the other side is the nightmare realm. Well, if that wasn't a foreboding name, Shouta didn't know what was. A pit settled in his stomach. You're kidding, Stan said flatly. Ford shook his head. Unfortunately not. And based on these readings, the boundary between realities isn't just weakened now, it's actively cracking. We need to shut this thing down. There was a small intake from Todoroki Fayumi. Would this affect Shouta in any way? Considering, she trailed off, glancing at Shouta, before steeling herself and continuing. Considering what's happening with Cipher, in one of the fights earlier, he wasn't acting like himself. What do you mean by that? Shouta nearly snapped, his frustration at being out of the loop building. Who is Cipher? What's going on? Oboro shot him a sympathetic glance, but Ford ignored him, eyes wide. It certainly could, and he might be affecting it in turn. I can't imagine using his flames within such an unstable area would produce any results save for weakening the boundary more. which in turn would affect him even more. The man held up a strange, shimmering necklace. We need to get him the charm as quickly as possible. He's been using his fire the entire tournament, although to different degrees, Shouta said slowly. But he was born with it. Would Endeavor's fire weaken our reality as well? Suze was shaking his head. No dude, not that kind of fire. We're talking about the magic chaos flames he got back in Gravity Falls. He hasn't used that at all during the festival. Except now he's fighting against someone who can give him enough of a challenge that he might actually use them, Wendy pointed out grimly. And since you guys just got here to explain things to us, he doesn't know that he shouldn't be using them. Shouta was still very much confused, but he also got the gist of the situation, and he was not liking it. Right? I'm going to find Present Mike. We need to end this match now. Shouta was tired. It felt like the fight was dragging on longer than any of his other fights, and that made sense because Ochako was strong and tough, and their fight had certainly been flashy enough to impress any pros. If this had been any other day, he would have been excited at how things were going. But it wasn't any other day. It was the late afternoon, the culmination of an entire day spent in a place of wrongness where Cipher's thoughts and memories and knowledge kept encroaching on his brain, and he just wanted this to be over. It could be over. If he used his flames, it could be over now. They were at least as strong as Ochako's power in terms of telekinetic strength. They both lifted half of the citizens of Gravity Falls to safety when the stone chair fell apart during Weirdmageddon. But he shouldn't because things got worse after he used them last time. But he could end this faster with them and not have to deal with feeling this way for as long as he might otherwise. But there was a moment where Ochako grabbed him with her power and was about to lift him through a hole that had been blasted into one of his ice walls, and Shouta. It was instinctive. He didn't even think about it. At the moment, there was no hesitation. He summoned his flames, and he and Ochako swapped places, right before she flew into the hole in the ice, and, technically, out of bounds. Midnight probably couldn't see it, but Ochako wasn't the kind to cheat and pretend she was still in, especially when up against one of her friends, and Present Mike probably saw it too, which meant the match should be called and over. Time got weird. His flames were still active. Ochako hovered there where she was sent, blinking in confusion, clearly aware like he was but equally unnerved by the weird feeling of something being wrong. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. Shouta's flames flickered, and everything hovered there, on the precipice of a clearly breaking moment. Shouta could almost hear how it cracked. And then it shattered. It was like the world around them crumbled in on itself, blending together with another place, time and space wavering in folds and loop-de-loops. The stadium, both surrounded and smudged together with a space of stars and strange colored bubbles, wavering in between the two realms, not quite in one or the other, but also somehow in both. Pieces of stadium dripped upwards and fractured into starlight, while other parts sagged under their sudden increase of weight. Cracks spreading outwards. With a shattering point like this, it wouldn't take too long before the break spread throughout their universe, everything collapsing together as the things from outside found their way in, and vice versa. And Shouta. Shouta felt at home. Not his actual home, of course, because he'd destroyed that, hadn't he? And maybe he regretted it, just a bit, but mostly he'd been bored and everything there had been so lifeless. And while the nightmare realm had kept him trapped for so long, it was also so much more to his taste, wasn't it? Why had he been so afraid before? Nothing was wrong. In fact, everything was right. There were startled screams that never happened, most of the stadium's audience collapsing into states of quantum uncertainty, bodies not built to exist in multiple dimensions at once like this. Shooting Star, Sparks, and Sunshine were fine, of course, as part of the altered Zodiac and the original for Shooting Star, but most weren't so fortunate, were they? A part of Shouta's fracturing mind clung to the few he truly cared for, keeping them safe with a spare thought. Most of him couldn't give a damn at the moment. And why should he? That amphibian had followed through. Sixer might have tricked him, and Stanley Pines might have punched him out of existence, but he was alive again. He'd lived on. Shouta threw back his head and laughed. It's finally the last battle of the UA High School Sports Festival. The top of the first years will be decided with this one match. The final, so to speak, from the hero course, Todoroki Shouta versus Also from the hero course, Uraraka Ochako, match start. You know you can put your homework down for a while and watch the final, Himari teased. Most people are watching the sports festival instead of doing work, and they don't have a little brother that's participating in it. Natsuo sighed, running a hand through his hair as Shoto engaged in yet another battle on live television. I know, but I've been putting this off for a while, and it's due in 2 days now. Besides, like I've told you, he's my little brother, but he's not, I barely know him. And wasn't that fucked up? That he could live with Shoto for most of his life and know absolutely nothing about him? He loved the kid, of course, but the boy on television was practically a stranger. Natsuo might have been trying to focus on homework, but he also couldn't stop himself from checking every now and then, and everything he'd seen of Shoto had been wild. The wind, for example. Natsuo understood how Shoto could have produced it in theory, but he hadn't known Shoto could put that into practice. He'd been using his fire too. Not nearly as much as his ice, but it had shown up several times at least. Hadn't Shoto been swearing up and down that he would never use his fire the last time Natsuo had seen him? And of course, there were those other 3 kids. The ones who had been kidnapped by that villain alongside Shoto. All of them, including Shoto, had immediately helped each other through the first 2 rounds. They looked like they'd gotten close, and Natsuo was glad that Shoto apparently had friends now. But the Shoto he remembered was completely uninterested in making friends like that. Natsuo had known that he would miss a lot when he moved out, and he was fine with that. It was a small price to pay for getting out of that damn house. But he should have at least called Shoto or something when he'd been found. Should have done even a little more than watch the news and maybe cry a bit in relief. When Fayumi had asked if he'd wanted to come and see Shoto, though, he'd turned her down. Shoto was alive, and since that was all confirmed, Natsuo wanted to focus on other things. He'd just left that house last year. He couldn't just go back like that. Fayumi had barely texted him these past couple weeks. She was probably pissed at him. Natsuo didn't totally blame her. Comforting arms wrapped around his chest, and Himari leaned forward into his shoulder. What have I told you about self-deprecation? I didn't say anything, Natsuo protested half-heartedly. Himari snorted. You're my boyfriend. You think I can't tell when you're thinking it? She kissed his cheek. I'm not going to say all your choices when it comes to your little brother are perfect, but you also need to think about yourself and your own mental health. You deserve to be safe and happy too. Natsuo sighed and kissed her back. I know. I can't help but feel bad though. She smiled and poked him gently. Then the least we can do right now is watch him win the tournament, right? All right, you win. Natsuo chuckled and turned back to the TV. There was a hole in Shoto's ice wall now. It looked like the girl, Uraraka, was attempting to throw him through it. Shoto's hands lit up with what? Natsuo didn't know he could make his fire blue. The screen turned to static. Himari frowned, grabbing the remote and trying to get it working again. That's weird. Did a satellite cut out or something? From outside, there was a strange noise, one that rang out in Natsuo's eardrums, bouncing around in his brain, like the sound when glass cracked, but even stranger. What the hell is that? He ran to the window. The sky was cracked. Like something had split open the heavens itself, a dark crack in the sky, red, yellow, and purple light shining through, slowly growing larger and larger as it continued to move outwards. Even with his window closed, Natsuo could hear the surprised shouts of students around campus. There was one section of the crack that was slightly larger than the rest, and he looked up towards it. A massive eye blinked back. You've been watching the festival more intently than you do most years, Centipter noted, passing by with a stack of files in hand. You did that last year too, before taking on Tagata. Someone caught your eye again? You could say that, Mirai agreed. He'd certainly been curious. It had felt like a betrayal all over again when he'd offered to introduce Mirio to Toshinori, only for Toshinori to say that he'd already found a successor, some quirkless kid he'd picked up off the street. Mirai had nothing against the quirkless. Toshinori himself had been quirkless once upon a time, but it had also seemed like Toshinori had chosen someone he didn't even know, a boy with no experience, just because he thought he could relate to the kid. out of sentiment, essentially, rather than actual consideration as to the legacy of the symbol of peace and the continuation of one for all. With that in mind, Murray had been practically predisposed to dislike Midoriya Izuku. Then the boy had gotten kidnapped, alongside 3 other students, at the S-J. And while Murray might not have considered the boy a proper successor, he was still just a child with only 3 days of official training, facing a villain with a warp quirk. One of the other students taken was Endeavor's son, who presumably had much more training. Midoriya couldn't be faulted for it, and Toshinori must have been going out of his mind with worry. Thankfully, all 4 students had been found only 3 days later. So now Mirai was curious as to how Midoriya would perform in the sports festival and whether Toshinori had made the right decision. How would the boy do when stacked up against the rest of his class? Exceptionally well, was the answer. Midoriya had won the first round, not just because of him using a low percentage of one for all, but because of what seemed to be his own analysis and strategy to complement it. His team had made the cavalry battle a joke. He'd broken free of the brainwashing boy, and only lost in the quarterfinals due to going up against Endeavor's son, who simply seemed to have more training and a better handle on his power. What caught Mirai's eye most of all, however, was his cooperation with the other kidnapped students. They had all helped each other in the first 2 rounds, and done so with a smoothness that came from a long period of trust. When Midoriya had been singled out during the cavalry battle, the other 3 hadn't hesitated to team up with him anyways. If Midoriya could build that sort of loyalty in only 3 days, perhaps, despite the circumstances in which he had been chosen, Toshinori had actually come across someone worthy of his mantle. Murray did wonder about the fact that most of the time, Midoriya only seemed to be using a downplayed version of One for All, but if the issue was with controlling the quirk, that could certainly be helped with. Murray had worked with One for All for years. If he could help Miria with permeation, then he could certainly help Midoriya with One for All. And besides, having seen the boy in action, Murray was curious. Would Midoriya live up to his expectations if they met in person? "I'm going to offer Midoriya an internship," he explained to Centipter. "I think there's a lot I can teach him." "You got it," Centipter immediately agreed. "He seems like an interesting kid." Then the man frowned. "Hey, did something happen? The sports festival just cut to static." Murray turned back to the screen and saw that Centipter was speaking the truth. "That is strange." There was a noise, one unlike anything Murray had ever heard. The next moment, he was doubling over in pain. He could hear Centipter rushing towards him, calling out his name, and then everything was drowned out by visions, despite him not touching anyone. There was his old vision, one of Toshinori's death, one that had haunted Murray's nightmares ever since he'd received it. And then, the vision glitched, and suddenly, it was different. Murray watched, stunned, as Toshinori, in his small, broken form, battled and equally injured all for one using some sort of power armor. How? The vision glitched again, and changed once more. Now, Toshinori was standing there, still small, but noticeably more healthy than he'd been in the past 5 years, smiling on a wooden porch as he watched Midoriya sparring with someone on the lawn, the underground hero Eraserhead, and an older man Murray didn't know next to him. Another vision popped up, a vision of himself. He watched himself die in the hospital while hooked up on tubes, the devastated face of Mirio. And then the new vision glitched once more, and he was seeing a few days past the vision of his death. Now he was smiling, a young girl with white hair on his lap. That shouldn't be possible. His visions didn't change like that. "Do you think you command destiny yourself, Sir Night-Eye?" Murray shuddered, spinning around to try and identify the voice, but then he was back in his office, Centipter hovering over him, with an expression that on Centipter clearly displayed worry. "Sir Night-Eye, are you all right?" Frankly, Murray had no idea. He was still trying to wrap his head around what he'd just seen. But he nodded and let his sidekick help him to his feet. Outside, the sky was cracking apart, strange lights shining through. Slowly, ever so slowly, the tip of a massive claw started poking through one of the cracks. The television screen still showed nothing but static. There were screams starting by their agency, the beginnings of mass panic among the populace. "This is insane," Centipter murmured. "What do we even do about something like this?" Murray had no idea. A part of him was still distracted by the visions, by the fact that something had happened at the sports festival, that he had no idea if Toshinori, Mirio, or Midoriya were okay. But he had to put all of that aside for now. The people clearly needed heroes to help calm them. He couldn't do that if he was panicking himself. "We focus on the people," he said. "We make sure no one is hurt in the panic that clearly starting out there. We protect whoever we can." That was their job as heroes, after all. This year's bunch of hero students were rather fascinating as a whole, All for One mused, considering how they'd survived against Tamura's first assault. But it was the 4 students who hadn't that intrigued him the most, and watching them in the sports festival only confirmed these feelings. "We should get our hands on them. Those girls especially," Garaki was saying, as they watched the final match. "Not only because of their multiple quirks, but because they could also lead us to Kirigiri." Multiple quirks indeed. All for One knew their files. Midoriya Izuku had a power listed as super strength, and yet, during his first and second tournament fight, he'd broken bones and immediately healed them. Garaki might not have noticed, but All for One certainly did. Uraraka Ochako had a gravity-nullifying quirk, and yet the entire festival, she'd been using an extremely strong telekinesis quirk. The one who intrigued All for One most was Ashido Mina. Her quirk was acid-based, and yet now she was displaying super strength. A young student suddenly showing super strength, right after All Might joined the UF faculty. That was something he certainly couldn't ignore. It was entirely possible that One for All had been passed on to Ashido. And yet, that didn't explain why 3 out of 4 students suddenly had new quirks. As for the youngest Todoroki, there was always the chance that he was hiding a new quirk as well, based on the other 3. All for One wouldn't rule out the possibility. And considering the boy's older brother, he'd be remiss to ignore the potential. Indeed, perhaps there is someone like you out there, Doctor, who modified them. "Not a chance," Garaki scoffed, offended. "There is no one who can create nomas like mine. And if someone out there could transfer quirks like you, we would have heard of them by now." And yet, here these hero students are, at least 3 out of 4 bearing another quirk. And perhaps whoever did this to them has Kirigiri. And there was someone. All for One had been furious at Kirigiri when he directly disobeyed orders and sent 4 students somewhere completely different. But when Kirigiri had returned, he'd admitted that he'd had no intention to send them anywhere but the Usti. Considering the circumstances of Kirigiri's existence, he was of course unable to tell them anything but the truth, which meant that someone had been able to hijack Kirigiri's portals. Then, as an additional insult, they'd had to sacrifice Kirigiri to the heroes in order to make sure Tamura got out all right. Tamura was still furious. He'd bonded rather nicely to Kirigiri, but the downside to this was his seeming protectiveness over him. All for One had made sure the boy was angry at the correct target, the heroes, but it was still an unwelcome loss. Kirigiri had made excellent transportation. And then Kirigiri had seemingly broken out of Tartarus. The heroes had assumed that they'd underestimated the power of his warp quirk. All for One knew differently. He'd made Kirigiri to be powerful, but not powerful enough to escape Tartarus by himself. Kirigiri had been broken out of prison by an outside force, using his own quirk. Considering his quirk had been hijacked once before, it couldn't be a coincidence. Whoever had sent those 4 students outside the Usta had now taken Kirigiri. All for One would very much like to meet them, to determine how much of a direct threat they were, or if they could be reasoned with, and he was extremely interested in the new quirks they had given those students. He had told Tamura to watch the festival carefully, but he himself was just as invested. On the screen, Uraraka nearly threw Todoroki out of bounds, and then both of Todoroki's hands lit up with a blue flame. One that looked nothing like the fire he displayed earlier, nor did it look like his father or brother's fire. Others wouldn't have caught it. They didn't have the quirks he did, the enhanced senses he possessed, even without actual eyes. But right before static covered the screen, there was a flash of the same blue. Even as the world cracked open, All for One smiled. Whoever had given the youngest Todoroki a power like that, they were certainly no hero. He'd let the heroes clean up their students' mess. Then, when the dust settled, he would swoop in and collect his prizes. A villain got Tensei. His mother's words kept playing in repeat, over and over, as Tenya rushed for the exits. As much as he'd wanted to watch Uraraka and Todoroki's final match, he couldn't focus on anything else, other than the pounding in his head, and the fact that a villain had gotten Tensei. This wasn't supposed to happen. Tensei was strong and brave and honorable. He led so many people and was widely respected. He was Tenya's amazing big brother, and a villain had gotten him. Tenya moved through the halls of the stadium, for once not caring about how many people he bumped into. He had to leave now. He had to go see Tensei before. No. Mother said he would be all right. He had to be. Tensei would never die at the hands of some villain. Tenya's chest clenched painfully, and he picked up the pace, moving as fast as he could without using his quirk. The air around him changed, as though the universe had suddenly shifted into a different gear. Tenya blinked and slowed, because it suddenly felt like he was moving through molasses. Around him, the people he was walking past were barely moving at all. He didn't have long to wonder about it. Behind him, noises of surprise started, and then cut off so quickly that if time wasn't being strange, Tenya never would have heard them at all. He turned around. There was a wave of sorts. Tenya had no other words to describe the steadily encroaching change in reality moving towards him. As it passed through people, they let out their startled exclamations, and then suddenly folded in on themselves. The places where most of the people had been now containing motes of starlight in different colors. Most of them, because some became even more changed, twisting into different shapes and forms. Blobs of flesh with orifices in the wrong places, inanimate objects, concepts. And even they too, eventually glitched into starlight. The wave continued towards him, and Tenya ran. He should have stopped. Should have turned around, shouldn't have fled while all the civilians around him were, whatever was happening to them. It was cowardly, and Tenya knew it, and he hated himself for it. But he also remembered the Usagi, and how running for help had been what had ultimately saved most of his classmates. If only the stadium was affected, or even if only part of the stadium was affected, he needed to let people know. There were plenty of pro-heroes around, including those inside the building. Getting help was a better option. And, though Tenya racked his brain, he couldn't figure out a way that he could fix this by himself anyways, or outrun the wave with even a single person on his back. The air still felt like molasses. It was all he could do to keep ahead of the encroaching madness. Tenya desperately shook his head, trying to drown out the sounds around him. Took a single look behind him and watched a young woman with a fire quirk literally melting away into a puddle of water, her face contorted in fear, and forced himself to only look forwards after that. And then finally an exit. The entrance to the stadium. Tenya reached the door and flung it open. And almost fell into the void. There was nothing outside the stadium. Nothing but stars and darkness and strange colors. In the distance, Tenya could see cracks of light, elongating but quickly drowned out by the void attempting to seep through. Where the hell were they? Was it like this everywhere? What about his friends and classmates, back in the booth? What about Tensei? The wave caught up to him, and Tenya braced himself. If this was it, and he was just going to die here, at the edge of a void, folded into starlight or worse, then maybe he shouldn't have left the booth in the first place. He couldn't reach Tensei. If only he could be with his friends. And then, as the wave hit, a shield of blue fire covered him, protecting him from whatever madness had swept the stadium. Tenya could see the fire, could almost hear it, but could feel no heat. A part of him wanted to reach out and touch it, but he didn't want to risk disturbing it. The wave passed, and the fire dissipated. Tenya was left there, alone in a hallway full of stars and shapes, staring out at a void. In the distance, he could see a large eye peering through one of the cracks, an eye that seemed to belong to some sort of Inkai dragon which had 16 other eyes like the one looking through. One of the dragon's claws was slowly, but not really slowly, just slowly on Tenya's timescale, rather than its piercing through another crack. Tenya looked down. Right beneath the door was the concrete the stadium rested on, and below that was a constantly shifting earth, creating and discarding patterns over and over again. He let out a slow breath and turned around to face the rest of the hallway, closing the door behind him. Why, Tenya? Why did that fire protect him, and no one else here? Was anyone else spared? What about Uraraka and Todoroki, who were fighting in the finals right now? He certainly wasn't going to take his chances in the void. Instead, he ran back through the hallway and towards his friends. It was so sudden, Momo didn't have any time to react. 1 second Todoroki and Uraraka were battling in the arena. It was hard to see what was going on with the ice walls, so Momo was watching the screens rather than the battle itself. Uraraka attempted to throw Todoroki through a hole in the ice wall, and somehow both of Todoroki's hands lit up with blue flames before he and Uraraka suddenly switched places. There was a split second where both of them seemed to pause. Todoroki looked terrified. Then the world fell apart. Momo had barely thrown her hands in front of her head to protect herself from whatever that was, before she was engulfed in the same blue flame that wreathed Todoroki's hands. Time seemed to stutter, the stadium contracting and expanding around her. The fire dissipated, and Momo gasped, looking around. In the center of the stadium, where Uraraka and Todoroki were, there was a swirling rainbow of shattered reality, every color, including those Momo had never seen before, mixing together within deep indigo. In the booth with her, Kirishima, Ajiro, Ashido, and Midoriya were looking equally stunned. Momo turned to Jiro to see if she was still there, and a yell escaped her. Instead of her friend, there was some sort of, well, Momo wasn't sure how to describe it except as visible sound, which buzzed around in confusion. In fact, most of their class was suddenly gone, replaced by different colored hovering lights. Aside from Jiro, the seat where Tokoyami was also stood out, there was an actual raven there now. What just happened? Kirishima's voice shook. What's going on? Hagakure, Ajiro reached for the seat next to him, where Hagakure had been, and where nothing currently was. He drew his hand back, hissing it was now covered in burns. The stadium itself seemed to be fracturing. Parts of it were collapsing, others were dripping upwards into light. Their booth seemed to be fine, apart from the fact that most of her classmates suddenly were made into something else. Oh God, what was going on? This isn't Cipher. Momo spun around. Midoriya was staring into the stadium, eyes wide, somehow ignoring all the colors that made her head hurt and her vision fuzzy. He looked up, and she followed his gaze. Instead of a blue sky, there was now nothing but an endless void of stars above them, with the occasional strangely colored bubble floating by. When Weird Mageddon happened, it didn't look like this. It's not him. Who is he? Kirishima asked, sounding as desperate as Momo felt. Weird Mageddon. Has this happened before? Are Todoroki and Uraraka okay? Why are we safe and not the rest of our classmates? It's a long story, Ashido admitted, ducking down and retrieving from her bag a far more worn grappling hook than the one she'd used against Uraraka. Long story short, Gravity Falls was in Oregon, but it was Oregon in another universe. The apocalypse happened, caused by Cipher, and we stopped it. It didn't look exactly like this though. Shadow protected us, Midoriya noted. Or he protected you guys. Mina and I seemed to be fine. He must have felt something going wrong. He kept saying something here felt off. But Cipher could also be a problem. We need to get down there. Mina. On it. Mina attached the grappling hook to the edge of their booth. Wait, hang on. Momo finally found her voice, shaky as it was. She'd suspected that there was a lot her friends weren't telling them about their trip to Oregon. But the apocalypse. So is or isn't this the same as when you were in Oregon? And how can we help? Kirishima added. How many people can that hook hold? Midoriya was already shaking his head. No, you guys should stay here. No wait, he cut off their protests. I know that sounds bad, and I wouldn't want to if I was you. But please, trust us. This isn't the same as before, but it is familiar, and it's dangerous, and we know how to handle it. We'll be right back, Ashido promised. She grabbed Midoriya and lowered them both with the grappling hook. A few seconds later, the hook unstuck itself from the booth and followed them down. Ojiro ran a hand through his hair, looking around the collapsing stadium. What the hell? What the hell? We've got to follow them, Kirishima insisted. And he wasn't entirely wrong, but also, shouldn't we trust them? Momo wondered. Apparently, they stopped an apocalypse. Yeah, but you heard them. That was different. They might need backup now. And Todoroki and Uraraka are down there too, and we can't just leave them, especially if Todoroki was the one who saved us. With that, Kirishima ran out of the booth. Momo exchanged a helpless glance with Ojiro before they both followed. The hallways were far worse than the booth. There were so many lights where people had been, just like their classmates, amalgamations that made Jiro and Tokoyami look tame. Momo could feel herself on the edge of panicking, and judging by the other two's expressions, they were as well, even Kirishima. She'd thought being attacked by villains at the UST was terrifying. Apparently, she hadn't even known terror then. They ran into Ida in one of the hallways, who looked immensely relieved to see them. "You're all right as well." Momo let out a shaky breath. "It's good to see you, Ida." And it desperately was. Surrounded as they were by a place completely broken, at least one more person was all right. "And you," Ida agreed. "Everyone else in the stadium," he swallowed. "Is it just our class that was spared?" Ojiro shook his head, eyes wide. "Not most of our class. Just us. And Midoriya and Ishido. Todoroki summoned some weird blue flames right before everything broke, and apparently they protected us. But he and Uraraka were right in the center of things. Midoriya and Ishido went down to try and help them. Apparently they were in another world's Oregon," Kirishima stressed, "and there was an apocalypse that happened there." Ida gaped at them for a moment. "I was protected by blue fire as well, and I'd suspected there was much more that they weren't telling us, but," he shook his head. "We can worry about past dangers later. We must help our friends now." Hopefully, there was something they could actually do to help. Ochako knew what was about to happen a second before it did. She could see Shouto's eyes widen in terror before everything shattered. And then, afterwards, she heard him laugh. It was a familiar laugh, the one that invaded her nightmares every so often. It sounded slightly different, coming from Shouto's voice rather than Cipher's, but there was no denying that it was Cipher's laugh. She'd only either heard about how Cipher took over Shouto's thoughts, or seen it from a distance before. This was different. Shouto was in front of her now, in their space of broken reality, hands still ablaze, and he might have still been himself, but at the same time he wasn't. Shouto blinked, and Ochako could see a shine of gold in his eyes, his pupils seeming almost slitted. From somewhere in the stadium, Mina and Izuku dropped down into the arena and ran over. Ochako had a moment to wonder how they'd gotten here so fast, and then considered the fact that time felt just as broken as everything else, and decided not to question it. "You know, there's a lot of irony to be had here," Shouto said suddenly, and Ochako stopped cold. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the other two freezing as well. Shouto was smiling, and while it wasn't completely Cipher's smirk, it also wasn't his. A commission for heroes, so determined to get one over on Yua that they insist on experimental technology that tears this world open into the nightmare realm. His eyes flickered up towards the stands, taking in the horror show as though it were an interesting stamp collection. "And they screwed over every hero here because of it. And I thought the people back in Gravity Falls were idiots. Looks like these chumps take the cake." Was that what had caused all of this? Some stupid experimental technology. At least that meant it hadn't been Shouto himself, just him using his flames in a bad place at a bad time. When Shouto was himself again, they'd have to remind him of that. Izuku was next to her now. Somehow, he'd crossed the space between them in just a few steps. Now, he winced as he took in their friend, face pale. "Shouto, you still know us, right?" Shouto rolled his eyes. "Seriously? You have to ask? You're supposed to be smarter than that, Sparks. Of course, then again, in another timeline you nearly broke your bones irreparably trying to beat me in a school fight. Isn't that just the dumbest thing? I wonder how much it would take to break your bones that badly here, considering those handy regeneration powers?" His smile widened. "No, that's a lie. I already know what it would take. Want to find out?" "Oh, that's definitely not good." At the very least, Shouto still responded to his own name. Izuku let out a shaky breath, before trying again. "Shouto, we can fix this. I mean, I'm not totally sure how we're going to fix the whole break in reality thing, but we can definitely help you. We just need to find Ford. He's got a charm that can limit Cipher's influence, remember?" Shouto was still smiling, and Ochako hated it. "What are you talking about? There's nothing to fix. I remember everything now," he laughed again. "Well, maybe not everything. That's a bit too many memories to be stuffed into a meat sack like this. I remember enough, though, and I'll remember more soon." He looked down at his hands, still on fire. "I'll really be me again soon enough." An icy chill went down Ochako's back. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded, eyes wide. Shouto looked at her, pupils definitely slitted, smile condescending and firmly in place. You think a skin suit like this is gonna hold on forever? When it has enough chaos energy to mold reality? Get real, sunshine. Eventually it's going to burn out. Not that it matters. I won't need it by then. No. If Shadow was telling the truth, would the charm even help for long? How much time would they have before Shadow's body gave out? It's your body, Mina reminded him, stepping forward. I know that it probably doesn't feel like it right now, but it is. Are you really okay with leaving it behind like that, Shu? Something about the nickname seemed to resonate in Shadow, and for an instant, the smile dropped. Then it was back in place, like it had never left. Of course, things are already so much better, and what's a human body ever done for me? Anyways, don't get me wrong, I do like having a physical form, but these things are practically built to be painful and annoying. Ochako blinked. That almost sounded like Cipher, but at the same time, it didn't. Shadow had described how much Cipher had enjoyed pain when he'd first stolen Shadow's body. That was why Shadow still had those bandages on his arms, because Cipher had liked pain enough to experiment with kitchen utensils. For Shadow to say now that he didn't like the pain part of being human. Most of his thoughts might be Cipher's. Most of his memories might be Cipher's. But Cipher hadn't completely taken over yet, even now. If Shadow really was Cipher now, after all, wouldn't he have attacked them? Finished them off, like he'd so desperately wanted to, the last time they'd seen him? Or at least mocked them more than just the light bit he was doing. Ochako shared a glance with Izuku and Mina, saw her budding hope reflecting in their eyes, and knew they'd caught it too. And you're fine with the rest of this? Ochako asked gently, gesturing to the stadium. With everyone here that we know being hurt like this? You say you remember everything, but did you forget about wanting to become a hero? You saved Yaoyorozu, Kirishima, and Ojiro, Izuku pointed out gently, and Ochako startled, because she hadn't realized that. Maybe even Ida as well. At least some part of you still cares. Are you going to let everyone else in our class suffer? Again, just for a moment, the smile dropped. Shadow flicked his head, as if trying to excise unwanted thoughts. It'll be fine, he insisted, his tone more forceful than before. It won't matter soon anyways. I thought everything was wrong before, but now I realize that it's right. It's all good, and soon it'll be even better. No more feelings of wrongness at all, no more concern, no more petty mortal fears that won't go away. No more Fayumi? Mina asked, pointedly. Are you willing to condemn her to this nightmare hellscape too? After everything? The smile finally fell away completely. For a moment, the golden shine in Shadow's eyes was gone, and his pupils were round again. The fire in his hands flickered. Just for a second, which lasted longer and shorter in this space where time didn't matter. Ochako saw her friend again. It made sense, Ochako realized. For all that Shadow wasn't attacking them, didn't seem to want to hurt them like Cipher did yet. Cipher still knew them. Cipher still had opinions on them. And Shadow was calling them by their zodiac signs, like Cipher did, so he was clearly affected enough by Cipher's opinion that they didn't seem able to reach him. But Cipher had never met Fayumi. She'd never even been in Gravity Falls. There you are. Fayumi watched, heartbeat bouncing around in her eardrums, as Oboro and Wendy physically restrained Aizawa from leaving the room. Let me go, Aizawa hissed. Everyone in the stadium vanished. Present Mike, Midnight, my students. Ford looked like he'd finally had enough. You won't be able to do anything for your friends and students if you leave this room. The protective enchantments against scenarios like this that I made only extend so far. If you leave the skybox, you'll fall into quantum uncertainty as well. Don't be an idiot. Shadow, please, Oboro begged. We can't fix this by running headfirst into it. And that's coming from me. It was Oboro's words that finally seemed to calm Aizawa down enough for the two to let him go. He stared at the door for one long final moment, before turning back to them with a scowl. Fine. Fine. You'd better have a damn good explanation for all of this afterwards, though. We'll explain as much as we can, Suze promised. It's super weird, though. No kidding. Fucking hell. Stan stared out at the scene in front of them. The absolute chaos that had seemingly taken over, with far more annoyance and far less fear than Fayumi was currently feeling. Seriously? Again? Ford shook his head. No, this is different. He checked over his instruments again, one of which had seemingly protected the skybox and everyone in it from whatever had torn the rest of the stadium apart. This stadium is currently in both the real world and the nightmare realm. The lines between the two realities outside of this stadium are cracking, but they're still separate. For now. And Shadow, Fayumi pressed, because her little brother was down there, in the middle of the chaos. Ford held up the charm. We need to get this to him now. If Cipher takes over here, he'll completely shred the barrier between worlds himself, and we'll lose Shadow for good. So what are we waiting for? Wendy practically snapped. Let's get down there and get him the charm already. Aizawa raised an eyebrow towards the elder pines. Judging by your expression, it's not going to be that easy. Ford grimaced. Shadow knows us, and if he's completely himself, he'll let us help him. If he's not though, Cipher probably won't let us come near him with this. Too much bad blood, even with Stan, Suze, and Wendy. Stan pinched his eyebrows. Damn it, you're not wrong. If that triangle bastard is in the driver's seat, or however this works, he's probably pissed about me punching him to death. And if I go, Aizawa wondered, I've never met Cipher before. But Shadow doesn't trust you. Aizawa turned to her, but Fayumi had already moved on. I'll do it. Are you sure? He's my little brother, Fayumi stressed impatiently. Out of everyone here, I have the best chance of getting through to him by a long shot. I'm going to help him. She turned to Oboro. Could you please get me as close to them as possible? You got it. Ford tossed her the charm, and she caught it. Be careful, he warned. Holding the charm will protect you until you get to the center of the shattering place, but don't push your luck. I'll be careful, Fayumi promised, although she had a feeling she wouldn't need it. Oboro's cloud surrounded her, and then a moment later, she was in front of the center of the fracture, with all its strange glowing lights and colors. Shadow was in there. He needed her. Fayumi gripped the charm tightly and ran inside. There Shadow was, standing slightly apart from his three friends, hands ablaze with blue flames that were so unlike Taoya's. His expression was all wrong, there was gold in his eyes, and his pupils seemed to change shapes every time he blinked, but he was still her little brother. And he still needed her help. Mina seemed to notice her first, eyes lighting up. Fayumi, she turned back to Shadow. Like I said, would you really be okay with her being hurt? I know you care more than you're letting on. Shoo! Fayumi's heart clenched at Mina's words. She could see the distress in Shadow's eyes. For a moment, he just looked at her, desperately. Then his eyes fell on the charm she was holding, and that horrible smile was back in place. Her little brother took a step back. Hey, what's one more sibling in this family getting fucked over? It's not like we aren't used to it. Even though nothing about that is actually what it seems. Hey, did you know Taoya's still alive? He's calling himself Dabai now. What an edgelord, am I right? Of course, he wants to kill me if we meet. Wouldn't mind killing Natsuo either, apparently. I mean, I get having daddy issues, but that's just ridiculous. Deal with all of that later. Fayumi took a deep breath and stepped towards him. When you talk about another sibling getting fucked over, are you referring to me? Or to you? She paused. Or to Natsuo, if both of us are stuck here? Shadow blinked. That's why does it matter? You were so angry and horrified when you found out father hit me, Fayumi recalled gently. She could see Shadow's friends' horrified reactions to her words, but in the moment, that didn't matter. Do you not care anymore? There was a flash of indignation, of that old anger Fayumi was familiar with when it came to Shadow. You told me how scared you were of losing yourself to Cipher, and hurting your friends, she continued. Of hurting me. Remember? That was only a couple weeks ago. Shut up. He took another step back. What does that even mean? I died a month ago. Taoya's burns had nothing on me. I should rub it in his face if he lives through this. Cipher died a month ago, Fayumi interrupted gently. You survived. Shadow, I can't imagine how hard it must be to have memories like that. But you lived. Don't you remember the past couple weeks? Are you going to let Cipher take them away from you? The conflicted look lasted longer this time, Shadow shaking his head, looking lost in his own or Cipher's thoughts, then shaking his head again. Hey, don't bring that thing near me. I said don't bring it over. I don't want it. You did though, Fayumi reminded him. Remember? I was wrong, he insisted, the gold in his eyes shining brighter. I don't need it. Everything's fine now. It's better this way. No more pain, no more hurt or worry or fear or guilt. And no more happiness, no more friendship, no more helping others. Because if Cipher thought he could get Shadow on board by appealing to the removal of all the horrible parts of his life, then Fayumi was going to remind him that there was good in his life as well. Shut up. For a moment, the flames in Shadow's hands shone brighter, surrounding her and freezing her in place. She could hear Shadow's friends calling out in a panic, but she ignored them, eyes locked onto her brother. A second later, the flames petered out, and Fayumi was released. Shadow looked far more surprised than she felt, staring at his hands in confusion. What the hell? Why can't I? Fayumi smiled. Because you're Shadow, not Cipher. You haven't personally hurt anyone here, only saved them. You haven't hurt your friends because you love them. And you're my little brother. You're not going to hurt me. No, that's not. Shadow shook his head violently again, looking from her to the charm, to his hands, and back again. No, Fayumi closed the gap and hugged him tightly. For a moment, Shadow struggled to pull away. Then he stood stock still. Time seemed to pass for an eternity. And then he melted into her arms, and the shuddering breath he drew was his. Fayumi. Fayumi beamed. I've got you. Shadow shook. I almost hurt you. I almost hurt you. You stopped yourself, she reminded him gently. I can't. He shook his head again, desperately. There's too much. Too many thoughts, too many memories, too much I can't. I don't know what's me anymore. And Bill's going to tear this break in space-time apart. And he's going to use me to do it, and I can't stop him. I can't. You can, Fayumi insisted, her heart breaking once more. Shadow, it's your power now, isn't it? Just like your quirk fire isn't father's, these flames are yours now as well. Cipher Bill, whatever his name is, you might have his thoughts and memories, but deep down you're still you. You always will be, and you can fix this. There was another long moment of silence. Shadow shook in her grasp, and Fayumi continued to hold him tightly. Then he sucked in a breath, and his flames rose up again. Fayumi wasn't sure if it was because she was holding her brother that she could feel it, but outside the stadium, things started to heal. Flames washed over the cracks, and they closed, forcing whatever hadn't yet made it fully into their world back into the nightmare realm. There were things that had already gotten in, one of which was the prevailing essence of weirdness. Things would never fully be the same after this. The stadium still hovered in and out of the nightmare realm and the real world, but even it seemed to stabilize, just a bit. No one who had already collapsed into quantum uncertainty returned to normal, but those of them who had survived were no longer in danger of it. Shadow's flames died down, and he shuddered, legs weakening. Fayumi, the charm I can't. Fayumi slipped the charm over Shadow's head. Immediately, symbols burst to life around him. Shadow's eyes stopped wavering, the golden shine disappearing for good, pupils settling back into roundness. The flames on his hands disappeared. He collapsed against her, and Fayumi set him down gently, holding him in her arms as the miasma of impossible colors around them calmed down, and the others in the skybox, as well as 4 more students and 2 teachers who had somehow made it through, ran over. Izuku practically fell down next to her with a shaking sob of his own. Mina knelt down and held Shadow's hand, while Ochako grabbed Mina to steady herself. They were still stuck in the nightmare realm. Most of the people in the stadium were gone, and Shadow still had Cipher lurking underneath the charm. But, for now, things seemed hopeful. Aside from the mystery crew, Yayurazu, Ida, Ojiro, and Kirishima, as well as everyone who was apparently in the skybox when the world shattered, it seemed that All Might and Nedzu had also survived. Izuku wasn't completely surprised about All Might, even if he was ridiculously happy about it. One for All was the weird kind of quirk that could probably keep someone from collapsing into quantum uncertainty. Although it did mean that suddenly 4 more students knew about All Might's small form, even if they didn't know about One for All. They'd clearly been shocked, but not as much as anyone else might have been considering the circumstances. It really wasn't the weirdest thing going on. At least Izuku knew they were all the type of person to keep that to themselves. Nedzu was more of a surprise, however. The principal had waved it off, briefly mentioning some experiments that had once been performed on him, and Izuku had winced because considering how the US government had attempted to experiment on them, he figured that would have been awful enough that Nezu wouldn't want to talk about it. He was still kind of curious, though. Of course, the curiosity was mostly drowned out by the anxiety. Considering everything that had just happened, they had to let everyone who'd made it know about Weirdmageddon. Izuku sat on one of the couches in the skybox, Ochako holding his hand, Shadow on his other side leaning up against Mina, and Izuku was still marveling that they'd gotten Shadow back at all. They'd been so close to losing him to Cipher completely for a moment. Even now, with the charm, he still looked out of it, as Ford took the role of explaining the rift, Cipher, and Weirdmageddon to everyone. When he was finished, Oboro took over, hesitantly explaining how they'd found Kirigiri after he escaped and made him Oboro again. Ford didn't mention the bubble, but Izuku knew that was going to have to come up soon. He still wasn't ready for it. Ida, Yayurazu, Kirishima, and Ojiro looked horrified. All Might seemed pained. Nezu listened quietly, expression unchanging. And Aizawa just watched them the entire time, looking steadily paler, but also more pissed off. Finally, when Oboro finished, he spoke up, addressing the mystery crew. And at no point during any of the past 3 weeks did you speak up about any of this. Not when you returned from Gravity Falls. Not when you found Kirigiri, or when Oboro came back. Not when you knew this cipher would be an issue again. Shadow flinched, curling in on himself, and Mina glared at their teacher. Stan seemed to share her sentiment. And what would you have done about it, he countered. Not like you'd have been able to help Shadow with this in the first place. The kids got us involved as soon as they could, which was the smart thing to do, because Poindexter actually knew how to help. Aizawa didn't look happy, but still seemed to acknowledge this. And with Oboro, when I told you 4 Kirigiri had broken out of prison, you still said nothing. And how were we supposed to know what you would do with that information? You threatened to expel us just for coming in last on a test on the first day of school. Ochako pointed out. And what about anyone you might have told? We couldn't let Oboro just be shipped off to Tartarus again. And what if the same people who created this whole break in reality mess found out what Shadow could do? Mina added fiercely. We already had government agents try to take us away and experiment on us back in Gravity Falls. We weren't going to deal with that again. Of course not. That's entirely reasonable. Izuku looked to Nezu and found their principal's eyes glittering something dangerous. Right. That would bring up some bad memories, wouldn't it? And those in the commission who pushed for the anti-warp technology certainly won't be getting away with it, not if I have anything to say about it, which I will. But even then, All Might's voice wasn't at all accusatory, not like Aizawa's, but Izuku could hear the hurt there, and the guilt rose up in him once again. You didn't even wish to tell us about the fact that you had survived an apocalypse. I understand why that would be hard to talk about, but is there something we did that made you trust all of us so little that you said nothing? Izuku could fear the tears coming. We do trust you. It's not that, I swear. It's just after the bubble. He cut himself off, hands flying up to his mouth. The bubble? Kirishima asked, hesitantly. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Wendy sighed. Yeah, okay. Long story short, Izuku was right next to Cipher when he broke into our reality, and he trapped him in this prison bubble. Eventually the rest of the kids, plus Suze and I, made it in to help free him. Turns out that inside the bubble was your school, and the trap was that the kids had supposedly made it home, with all the students and teachers and everyone. Course, we knew it was fake, but it was pretty realistic. Suze continued the story. We found Izuku and let him know that he and the other dudes hadn't actually made it home. Soon as he realized that, the illusion broke, the walls started bleeding, and all the fake students and teachers tried to murder us. We had to fight our way out. Suze and Wendy were great. They made it sound like it wasn't Izuku's fault in the first place, just bad luck. Still, Izuku hunched in on himself as everyone turned to look at him. We know it wasn't actually any of you, Ochako offered, voice quiet and shaky. It was just... You still had versions of us try to kill you, Ida finished, horror written all over his face. And you had to take them down to escape. Ochako flinched and avoided his eyes, but nodded. Wendy looked at Izuku again, before sighing. I shot a fake in the throat while we were escaping. The exploding boy. Saw him here at the festival and had to remind myself that I hadn't actually killed him. Oh, because of course that would haunt Wendy almost as much as killing the fake All Might haunted Izuku, even though she didn't know Kaken. How had he not thought about that before? The fake All Might tried to kill us, Izuku finally whispered. I had to stop him. Ochako gripped his hand tightly. All Might's face was awash with pain. Young Midoriya. You went through a lot. Aizawa no longer looked angry, just tired and sad. More than any US student should go through, much less first years with only 3 days of training. It wasn't all bad, Mina assured him, smiling slightly. Most of our stay in Gravity Falls was awesome, actually. And we met a ton of great people. She nodded towards Stan, Ford, Suze, and Wendy. And we went on a lot of adventures. We might just be hero students here, but we really accomplished a lot, and saved a lot of people, and made a bunch of friends. Gravity Falls was great. We were so happy that we got to meet you dudes too, Suze said. Indeed, I'd love to hear more details about your time in Gravity Falls later. Nedzu clapped his hands together. For now, however, we are still stuck in this nightmare realm, and every other student, hero, and civilian is out of commission. If there's a way to fix this, that should be our first priority. Agreed? Ford sighed. At this point, it looks like invoking the axolotl is our only chance for both returning this stadium to its correct reality, and getting rid of Cipher for good. I have a few old allies here that I can reach out to, who can direct us towards a place where we can contact the axolotl. After that, the trick will be figuring out how to get it to agree to help us. Yaoyorozu started hesitantly. If you don't mind me asking, what do axolotls have to do with any of this? Oh, right. I'm so sorry. Mina winced. Shouto, no, it wasn't your fault. We don't blame you. He looked away, and she pressed forward. We don't blame Izuku for Weird Mageddon. Do you blame him for that? Of course not. Then don't blame yourself for this. It's still Cipher's fault. And also the Hero Commission's fault, I guess, for apparently installing anti-warp tech so messed up that it literally tore a hole in reality. Mina's right, Ochako agreed. You just got caught in the crossfire. And we didn't know about how reality was tearing open. So there's no way you could have known that you shouldn't have used your flames in our fight. Shouto's eyes flickered to Mina, then to the ground. I should have left when you suggested it. If we had, this wouldn't have happened. Mina could see Ochako and Izuku look at her curiously, but she shook her head. Maybe, but you did say that it probably wouldn't have gotten better by that point anyways, didn't you? And again, you didn't know. None of us knew. Izuku tried for a smile. It's like Fayumi said before, isn't it? Even when Cipher had almost completely taken over, you never heard us. You saved our friends. Cipher would never have done that. So even during that whole mess, you still managed to fight him off. Ochako waved an arm around. And I don't know if you noticed, but you also kind of saved our entire world outside of this stadium. It would have cracked from the bad tech anyways, but you fixed it. That was incredible. And once we find the axolotl and clear the rest of this up, that makes 2 realities we've saved, doesn't it? Mina pointed out, grinning. Our record is looking pretty good so far. A ghost of a smile passed across Shouto's face. He held the charm in his hands, before his fingers curled around it, and the smile fell. I'm sorry for you were trying to bring me back. You were all trying to help, and I just... Hey. Ochako nudged him gently. Cipher knew us. He didn't know Fayumi. Of course she was going to get through to you better. We're not mad, okay? We're just happy she was able to get through to you, at least, Izuku agreed. Shouto didn't seem so sure. I guess. But you're like family to me too. And, he turned to Mina. It should have, there was something else, something I knew. I think, some reason it should have worked. I don't remember anymore, but there was something else. Don't worry about it. Mina was definitely curious as to what that something was, but not nearly curious enough to do something stupid like trying to push Shouto into remembering his mindset when he was Cipher. How are your memories, by the way? Are they still? Shouto gave a small shrug. Bill's Cipher's stuff is still there, to an extent, but with the charm, it's like I can sort them out from my actual memories. It's easy to tell that they're not mine, and I can better remember being me than I could without it. Even with the charm, I don't know how long that's going to last. Bill, I knew something about my body not being able to contain this much chaos energy. It didn't really make sense to me before, because the most I'd ever used my flames on was with that Cthulhu monster, and Ochako did the same thing, didn't she? But then, fixing all those cracks in reality. Right? Mina had been trying not to think about that, because it sounded absolutely terrifying. We'll find the axolotl well before that happens. It won't get to that point. Her friend nodded slowly, and Mina leaned in to give him another hug. It's gonna be okay. We've stopped Cipher before, even when the odds were impossible, Izuku said. I think our chances are a lot better than they were during Weird Mageddon. Yeah. They would fix this. They had to. Shouta, please don't be mad at them. They really did save me. Shouta grimaced. He wasn't mad, not anymore. A part of him was still indignant, even after everything he heard, as he watched Ford and Nedzu discussing plans for hunting down what was apparently a cosmically powerful amphibian. Was still furious at being locked out of the loop, especially considering that Oboro was alive, and no one had even thought about telling him. But he also understood. He still believed that his logical ruses and stern teaching methods were important to prepare his students for just how harsh life as a hero could be. But he was also more than self-aware enough to realize that in this case, they had backfired horribly. The problem quartet didn't trust him because they had no reason to trust him, so far. Not many of his students ever came to him with their genuine problems, did they? He was able to prepare them for their potential futures as heroes, but now he was starting to see the downsides to his methods. He'd thought it was fine if his students disliked him, as long as they actually survived, but Oboro was here. He was right here, sitting next to Shouta, looking at him anxiously with yellow eyes that used to be blue. He was alive. He'd been alive this whole time. Kurogiri hadn't been anything close to recognizable at the Ostia, nor when they'd captured him in order to try and find their missing students, but apparently Shouta's friend had been under there. I'm not mad at them for saving you, Shouta finally said, because how could he be? I'm mostly mad at myself. You were alive this whole time, for 13 years, being experimented on and brainwashed, and I never knew. Apparently, he'd failed to realize Oboro was still alive, all those years ago. Failed to realize that the body they'd cremated wasn't even his friend's. God. If they fixed this when they fixed this, how the hell was he going to tell Hisashi and Nimiri? It's not your fault, Oboro insisted. The guys who took me were really good at covering their tracks. And like I said, I only remember things before I was actually fully turned into Kurogiri, and I'm still 17. Yeah, that means at least 12 out of those 13 years, I was probably too far gone. So it's okay, I promise. Shouta let out a small huff of disagreement, because nothing about what Oboro had gone through could ever be fine, but didn't voice those thoughts just yet. We're here now, he'd said, back in Gravity Falls, and Stan had scoffed. Yeah, now that the dust has settled and everything's fine. And he hadn't pressed on that, had he? He'd failed Oboro. He'd gone to Gravity Falls, even for that short period of time, and had no idea just what had been going on with his students. They hadn't trusted him enough to tell him anything. Shouta was certainly beginning to think he'd failed them too. Oboro nudged his side. Hey, chin up, Shouta. I'm here now, aren't I? And this whole break in reality mess is something we can actually work on. We'll fix this. They had to. The survival of Shouta's other friends, 12 of his students, and almost all of the entire stadium depended on it. If this was meant to be another chance, then he wasn't going to waste it. Young Midoriya, I'm not angry. All Might's voice was gentle, and Izuku couldn't hear any lies in his statement. Knowing what I know now, I understand why you didn't want to talk about this before. You went through something terrible. His mentor winced, and partially at the hands of a fake version of myself. Izuku bit his lip, eyes watery. I should have known, though. Should have realized it was an illusion at first, at least. There were some things that didn't completely add up, but it was like there was this fog in my brain that made it so I didn't think about that stuff until everyone came to save me. All Might's eyes widened. Ah, young Shinso's quirk? It's not his fault. Like I told my friends, he didn't ask for a quirk that would remind me of all of that. And even when we got out of the bubble, and then we got home and I got to see the actual you again. And all I could think about was how the fake All Might tried to kill me, and I killed the fake All Might with the quirk you gave me, and I flinched, and I'm so sorry. Massive hands closed around his own. Young VERYYYY, All Might began, voice deep and calming. I don't blame you in the slightest. What you went through was horrific, and you never should have been put in that position. But when you were, you did what you needed to escape it. I'm not mad at you. I could never be mad at you for something like this. The tears were flowing freely now. It was my fault, Izuku whispered. There was this time traveler, Blendin. A while before Weird Mageddon, he promised us that if he found a way to help us get home, he'd let us know. He approached me when I had the rift in my bag by accident, and asked if I could hand it over to do some scans. It turns out he was possessed by Cipher, so it's my fault that I was trapped in the bubble in the first place. All Might was silent for a moment. I don't know much about this Cipher, he finally began, but it sounds like he's been around for a very long time, with immense amounts of practice at tricking people. That you momentarily fell for it while he was possessing an ally is not a mark against you, especially considering how little training you had. Oh. And it was one thing to hear everyone else say it. But, All Might. Yagi. Izuku looked up. All Might gave him a smile. My name is Yagi Toshinori. Frankly, I should have told you earlier, but now will have to do. I hope you'll forgive me. Izuku's lip wobbled. He practically fell forward into a hug. All Might Yagi hugged him back just as tightly. There's one thing I can't help but notice, Nedzu said lightly. Of all the people Todoroki saved, Endeavor was not one of them, despite him being in the stadium. Fayumi really should have expected this. Next to the principal, Ford seemed to barely restrain himself from making a comment. Stan didn't bother, scoffing openly, while Wendy rolled her eyes. Nedzu took this all in, before turning to Fayumi. Eraserhead brought up to me, a couple weeks ago, that he was worried about Todoroki. He told me that he suspected the boy was covering up bruises. And now, with this information, I'm seeing a rather interesting picture being painted here. I don't suppose you could explain any more to me? Fayumi looked at Nedzu for a long moment, her heart racing in her chest. Then she sighed. I assume you know what quirk marriages are, Principal. Nedzu's expression became sharper. I certainly do. Father always wanted a child with the perfect quirk, one strong enough to surpass All Might where he couldn't. Fayumi paused, trying to formulate the words, because this was Principal Nedzu, and if there was anyone who could help her little brother legally escape. That was why he married Mom in the first place. All of us, we were all considered failures until Shadow, who got the best of both quirks. So Father trained him, starting at age 5, and ignored the rest of us. He hit you. Fayumi paused to see Shadow walking towards them. He still looked rather out of it, a hand on his charm, but his eyes were focused and determined. You can't ignore that part. He hit you too, recently. It wasn't nearly as bad, Fayumi wanted to argue, but she also didn't want to set a precedent for downplaying abuse when it came to her brother. So instead she held her arm out, and Shadow curled up beside her. Stan came over and put a comforting hand on Shadow's shoulder, which seemed to relax him further. Their pop's a real bastard, the man said casually. No kidding. Wendy still looked pissed. We ran into him in the hallway briefly, and he acted like Fayumi's existence was a nuisance, and talked about Shadow like he was a thing, rather than a person. Dude is fucked up. Izuku's mother, Midoriya Co., Fayumi remembered suddenly. On the nights where Shadow stayed at her house, when things got too bad at home, she would take pictures of the injuries he came with. When this is over, we can get them. And we will, Nedzu agreed. Now that these suspicions are confirmed, I have no intention of letting Endeavor hurt his children any longer, either of them. He gave Fayumi a steady look, and she blinked. In fact, after the USJ, I've been thinking about certain safety measures I would like to implement at UA. This has only increased the need for them. And when they are implemented, Todoroki will be out of the house for the time being, while we investigate Endeavor further. Fayumi shared a surprised look with Shadow before turning back to Nedzu. We're listening. So, Gravity Falls? Ochako laughed awkwardly. Yeah, it was a bit different than we made it out to be, I know. A different world with magic, but no quirks is pretty crazy, Kirishima agreed. Especially considering how good you guys are now with your quirks as well. He looked over towards where Wendy was sitting with Suze. Hey, is that the hand-to-hand teacher you mentioned before? She doesn't look much older than us. That's her, Mina confirmed. Wendy's a real badass. When all of this is over, you should ask her if she'll give you guys some lessons as well. Izuku, having returned from his own talk with All Might, nodded. Ojiro nodded. We'll definitely do that. Shoto, back from speaking with Nedzu, winced slightly. Sorry for dragging you four into this. There is nothing to be sorry for, Ida insisted. You certainly aren't at fault for what happened, Todoroki. And besides, you didn't drag us into anything, Yaoyorozu pointed out. You saved us from the fate that the rest of the stadium shared. Personally, I can't thank you enough, Todoroki. Shoto stared at her wide-eyed. Mina nudged him gently, smiling. Oh, okay then. Kirishima laughed. What she said. Although now that we actually know, I would totally like to hear some actual Gravity Falls stories. It doesn't have to be apocalypse stuff, he hastened to add. But you haven't really talked about any of your adventures there before. Ochako blinked, realizing Kirishima was right. They really hadn't mentioned much of anything to their classmates, besides using the skills and items they'd gained, had they? Wait, no, that wasn't entirely true. Well, we did mention one, or rather two, of our adventures to Ida and Yaoyorozu, she admitted. Although we kind of framed it as a hypothetical. Ida blinked. Wait, do you mean the time-traveling scenario, with the pet who constantly got hurt? And the time traveler who challenged you to gladiatorial combat and tried to erase you from existence? That was real. Izuku laughed. Yeah, up until the end there, the sports festival wasn't nearly as scary because at least it wasn't a literal death match. That minefield and the fall in the second event would have been totally lethal in Globnar. Now I want to hear this story as well, Ojiro admitted, looking torn between concern and amusement. If that's the case, what did you actually do about the time traveler? Yaoyorozu wondered. We set him free, Mina admitted. We all felt really bad about getting him arrested because we were messing around with time in the first place, even if those time police guys did tell us that we weren't in trouble because we literally couldn't have known the rules. Still dunno if it was a good idea or not. He kind of got possessed later and was part of the reason Weird Mygeddon started. Ah. And the pet? Ida asked. Was that also real? Ochako brightened. Yup, that's Waddles. He's a part-time pig, part-time bear now. He's staying in Gravity Falls with Pacifica, who's a friend we made over there, since none of our homes could or would take care of him. But he's great. When this is all over, we'll introduce you to him too. And Pacifica, Shoto added. Right. And Candy and Grenda. I'm sure they'd love to meet all of you. Ida beamed. Then we'll look forward to meeting them. You have an idea of where we need to be heading. I do, Ford confirmed. There are some old friends and allies of mine currently here in the Nightmare Realm that I've managed to get into contact with. We'll be taking a ride with one of them in order to reach Jesselbrow, an oracle who knows best about the goings-on of the axolotl. He scooped up a bunch of wristbands and passed them around to everyone. These are dimensional translators. They'll help translate languages for you and let you adapt to the Nightmare Realm's weirdness outside the stadium without actually letting the realm physically change you. Is it built on the same principle that the loci used to translate Japanese into English for us and English into Japanese for you when we cross through the portal between our worlds? Izuku wondered, interested. I don't think so, Ford admitted. That seems to be a skill all of the loci's own. You all became fluent in English the longer you stayed. These will only translate so long as you're wearing them. All Might, Suze, and I will stay behind, Nedzu told them cheerfully. We'll monitor the stadium and let you know if anything changes here. If you encounter a threat that you cannot escape, Oboro will warp you back here. Oboro and Suze nodded along, clearly aware of their parts of the plan. I do apologize for this unconventional end to the sports festival, but I hope you 8 students will think of this as an exciting field trip. Mina squeezed Shouto's hand. You ready? Shouto nodded. Let's find this guy and finally end this. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 11. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author jkawsome on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.